Good morning, everyone. You know, I think we're going to start. The rain is slowing everything down a little bit. Some people don't like getting wet, and I don't blame them. But we'll start. You know, this has been quite a year here at the Florida Institute of Technology, because back earlier this year, Administrator Rothstein announced the Artemis program just across campus. And that was a big honor for us, and it was a lot of fun to meet and talk with him. And he made that announcement. We knew he was going to make some kind of big announcement, but we didn't know for sure what it was. And now today we have this. You know, I find it interesting that when NASA was first christened NASA and became the Space Agency Administration, Florida Tech was christened that same year as Brevard Engineering College, and eventually we became Florida Tech. There's a lot of people that are contributing to this. USRA, of course, the JFK Library Foundation, Delaware North, and Siemens was a big supporter. And then later today here, we're going to have Florida Today is going to unveil their a new documentary called The People of Apollo. So it's going to be a big day. I hope most of you can stay for the entire period. The three panels, we're going to talk about past and present and future. And it's interesting, the future panel is called Destiny. And of course, Destiny was the first U.S. module that was sent to the space station. And you know, the station really began to be put together in 98. It seems longer ago than that. But it's been flying for a while. It's a national laboratory in space. But today, I'm sure we're going to hear from some of the future panelists about the things we're going to do that are even greater than that. And I'm excited to hear that. You know, we're really lucky that we have someone in our area that has been a key figure in all the shuttle launches and has done so much to make popular the reporting of the space news and of the shuttle launches, etc. And that guy is named, he's a CNN correspondent, still works with them and for them, but it's, and I'm really proud that I can call him a friend at this point, but that's our host and MC for the day, John Zarella.
President McKay, thank you so very much. It is certainly a great honor to be part of this wonderful event. During the heyday of Apollo, this area from Titusville to the Cape, to Cocoa Beach, to Melbourne, was bursting with energy, enthusiasm, growth. That waned when Apollo ended, and again when Shuttle ended. Wasn't sustainable. Today and into the future, it will be. We'll be talking a lot about why in our panels this morning as we discuss where we were, where we are, and where we are going. And I want to reiterate our thanks today to our event partners, the JFK Library Foundation, the USRA, as well as Delaware North, Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, for loaning us this amazing rover here on stage with us. It's going to be raffled off later today, I understand. I think that was it, right? Yeah. The Siemens Corporation for today's lobby display, and the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation for all their support. And now it is my privilege to invite to the stage Suzy Cunningham, who is a Florida Tech alum, and Suzy is the Strategy and Integration Manager for Communication and Public Engagement at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Suzy's going to sing the national anthems. Suzy? Suzy, thank you so much. Suzy, I got to ask you, on your business card, do they fit that entire title on your business card now?
Yes.
They do? Okay. And now, please welcome Stephen Rothstein, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. Stephen?
John, thank you so much. It is truly an honor to be with you. Again, I'm Steve Rothstein from the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. We're at the Kennedy Library in Boston. I want to encourage those of you who haven't been to Boston, come, particularly in the summer, maybe not so much in the winter, but hope you'll come. But you can also go online. We have a lot of resources, including interviews with astronauts and things like that. When you think about President Kennedy's legacy, there is probably nothing that he was more proud of when you talk to his kids and grandkids than the work to go to space and his call to all of us as a country to come together, to really as a world to come together. So we're really honored to be part of this. Florida Tech is doing an amazing job, USRA, all of the partners for today, the corporate partners we appreciate, all of the speakers. So again, thanks for being with you and look forward to talking in a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen. And now it is my great privilege to bring to the stage Jeffrey Isaacson, who is President and CEO, Universities Space Research Association. Jeffrey?
Thanks, John. Morning, everybody. So great to be here. You know, a couple mornings ago, I was actually scraping ice off my windshield. And it's just amazing how quickly winter has come up north with simply a change of the clock. Well, when USRA was founded at the height of the Apollo era by the National Academy of Sciences and NASA, the express purpose was to foster cooperation among universities, governments, and other organizations. So when the JFK Library Foundation contacted us about helping with a so-called Moonshot symposium to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, we were very eager to participate. So I would like to start by thanking Florida Tech for hosting this event, and especially Giselle Bennett and Wes Sumner for their leadership in organizing it. I would also like to thank the JFK Library Foundation, especially Stephen, for suggesting the idea. For those of us that are old enough to have witnessed the Apollo 11 landing, even as in my case on a kind of fuzzy black and white television screen from Paterson, New Jersey, it remains, I think I can speak for most of us, one of those defining moments. And I don't mean to be cliche. You know, I was about 8 years old, and I can't stand here and tell you that I was riveted in front of that screen. I was actually tired. I mean, it was up late at night. I remember when the Eagle landed thinking, when are these astronauts going to pop out of their spaceship so I can go to sleep? But I think the important thing was that there was a huge afterglow from the event, not just with Apollo 11, but with the entire Apollo program and the space program in general. And that was the thing, I think, for me that opened up the wonder of the universe and, importantly, instilled immense pride in being an American. It also underscored something important today, just how cool it must be to be a scientist or engineer, if you couldn't be an astronaut, of course. And I really still think that's cool. Now, for an organization like University Space Research Association, had even greater significance. Our story really starts as early as 1966. And this is when the NASA administrator, James Webb, had contacted Frederick Seitz, who was the president of the National Academy of Sciences, to discuss how NASA might engage the research community in the operations of what was known as the Lunar Receiving Laboratory. All right? This was a facility at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston that was designed to quarantine astronauts and rock samples returning from the moon. By 1967, this became a formal request in the form of a letter from Webb to the Academy to take initiative in convening the representatives of a number of appropriate universities to discuss the formation of a consortium of universities which could assume responsibility for the management of a portion of the research carried out at the LRL. So you see, very early on, the NASA administrator, James Webb, recognized how critical the scientific community was to the success of the space program then and into the future. There were many consortia at the time of universities, and there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm, as it turned out, within the academic world for forming yet another. But one was approached to no avail. And in March of 1969, at that point, with Apollo 11 just 4 months away, NASA wrote to the Academy, and I'll read from the letter. NASA concurs that you should now move ahead with the establishment of an independent consortium of universities specifically oriented toward the problems of our national aeronautics and space programs. It would be particularly desirable to get such a consortium involved with the Lunar Science Institute in Houston as soon as possible in view of the imminence of a first attempt at a manned lunar landing and return of lunar samples to Earth for analysis and study. So the next day, the National Academy filed paperwork in the District of Columbia and established USRA with an original group of 48 member universities. By December of that year, USRA took over management of the so-called Lunar Science Institute for NASA, which was established to separate the science associated with returning samples from the quarantine of astronauts. And USRA still manages that institute today under the name Lunar and Planetary Institute. In fact, speaking on the Now panel this morning is Dr. David Kring, who is a principal scientist at LPI. Since those humble beginnings, USRA has expanded to operate in association with 111 member universities today, including our newest member, Florida Tech. We're very proud of that. And our work covers not just lunar and planetary science, but aeronautics, advanced computing, earth science, astrophysics, space life sciences, microgravity research, space nuclear research, and a variety of education programs. To this day, the core of what we do is still university partnerships, providing what I like to refer to as connective tissue to engage university research in the execution of federal agency missions. This is really just what James Webb envisioned. And the actions he set in motion 50 plus years ago ensured that USRA, as an institution, would be tied inextricably to Apollo 11 and its lunar samples. So, thanks again to Florida Tech and the JFK Library Foundation, and to all of you for participating in what I trust will be an interesting and inspiring symposium. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Now, I'd like to bring up to the stage a good friend of mine, a very, very young man who we have kind of a interesting checkered relationship over the years, stuff we've gotten into. Al Warden, Apollo 15 Command Module pilot. Al, are you behind me?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here. Nice to be here. You know what? I never dreamed 48 years ago, while I was making a trip to the moon, that I'd be standing here today awarding a couple of scholarships. And I think that's a wonderful thing about the space program. The Astronaut Scholarship Foundation has been in existence since 1984. The original 7 started, and it was originally called the Mercury 7 Foundation. And I have to say that Al Shepard kind of spearheaded that. Since that time, it has grown bigger and bigger and bigger, and we have now, today, given out some 500 scholarships of 10 grand each to a tune of about $5 million. I got to tell you, one of the problems with that, if you're involved with a foundation like that, is you got to go out and raise money, because these scholarships do not pay for themselves. So that's what we do. But I'll tell you, this effort is so critical to what we're doing today. We need these young people to study STEM courses. Why? Because they are our future. It's going to rest on these young people to do the things that have got to be done to get us where we need to go in space in the future. So it's a particularly happy thing for me to be able to give a couple of scholarships out today while we're here. And I'd like to say thank you to the sponsors for these two students. Andy North Andy Aldrin and Jim Hayes. We appreciate the fact that they have done this for us. So now, I guess, without taking too much time, I will call our scholarship recipients out on the stage. Let's see, we have Nathan Hadland. Nathan, would you come out, please? I have a thing on you, Nathan, but I don't have it with me. Nathan, I'd like to present you with a scholarship. Let's see what we got here. Okay. There's a certificate for your scholarship. And stay here. Yeah, stay here. And I'd like to ask Noah Nadolski to come out, please, and receive his certificate. Thank you. I think we'll start with, yeah, why don't you have a seat? Noah, why don't you come and say a few words if you'd like.
Okay. Thanks. Oh, man. So, yeah, I'm Noah Nadolski. I'm currently a senior here at Florida Tech, majoring in aerospace engineering and math. And when I was asked a couple days ago to come talk here, I was trying to figure out what to say, and I think I concluded that if I were to say that this scholarship changed my life, I think that would be a complete understatement. If you would have talked to my family when I was in high school and told them that I would eventually be working at NASA, working with Andy Aldrin on a project to further Mars exploration, and to be even looking at graduate schools in aerospace and math, I can tell you there's no way that they would have believed you at all. And now, through this scholarship, through the opportunities that they presented me and the connections, all of these things are a reality for me now. And I'm so grateful for this. And in addition, with the monetary aspect of this scholarship, I no longer have to worry as much about what's going to be the most lucrative career for me once I leave, and how am I going to pay off these massive amount of student loans. I actually get the opportunity to choose now. I get to say, what am I passionate about? Well, where do I want to make an impact, and what do I actually want to do? And I don't think that this is an opportunity that a lot of kids get when they're paying for their own school. So I'm really grateful for the foundation to give me this choice. And so I'd really like to thank the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation for supporting me for the past 2 years, especially this year, being sponsored by Jim Hayes in memory of the legend Chris Kraft. And I don't know where I would be without it. And in addition, I'd like to thank Dr. Palatai and Ramana, the research advisor and graduate student who I've been working with for the past couple years. These people have not only been research mentors to me, but they've been life mentors, and I can guarantee you that I would not be on this stage today without the impact they made on my life. So, thank you.
Okay, and I'd like to ask Nathan to come up and say a few words, please.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Nathan Hadland. I'm a senior pursuing a degree in astrobiology here at Florida Tech. I was first selected for the astronaut scholarship along with Noah in 2018 and again this year in 2019. So my research here at Florida Tech focuses on conducting atmospheric simulations of Neptune's great dark spots. I also investigate novel methods for in situ food production systems on the surface of Mars. I've worked at the University of Tennessee, the Lunar Planetary Institute, the Johnson Space Center, and NOAA's Earth Systems Research Laboratory. I was also part of Crew 205 in February of this year to the Mars Desert Research Station, which is an analog station in Utah, which mimics what it's like to live and work on the surface of Mars. I'll be returning to MDRS in January of this upcoming year as the executive officer with a full Florida Tech crew. The Astronaut Scholarship Foundation was the catalyst for all of these opportunities for me. They've provided me invaluable advice as I build my career in the space industry. And the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation is a community and a dynamic group of professionals and individuals that I'm grateful to have access to. I'm endlessly thankful to Andy Aldrin, Jim Hayes, and the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation's generosity and support in helping me achieve these dreams. To me, the Apollo missions represented the cutting edge of science for the time, and I want to be part of the same drive for exploration and curiosity today. I'm working towards a career in human spaceflight, and my research is part of that push towards going back to the moon and onwards to Mars. I'm inspired by the astronauts, scientists, and engineers in the Apollo era and how they paved the way for the American space age and the discovery of the solar system. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to recognize two exceptional scholars, and I got to tell you, they are our future. We need to support them. So let's give them a hand, please.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win. Great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I will introduce the panelists. Our first panelist in this first session is Suzy Cunningham. You know her already. Strategy and Integration Manager for Communication and Public Engagement, NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Suzy? Sure. Stephen Rothstein, the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. Stephen? Mr. Bob Seek. He is retired, the Launch Director and Director of Shuttle Processing, NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Bob. He's solid, retired. He was Vice President and General Manager, Space Systems, Rockwell. And the man who needs no introduction, Al Worden, Apollo 15 Command Module. Al? You guys didn't get your microphones. Jeez, we give them one thing to do. Pick up the microphones. Everybody has one now? Now, let's get this panel started with a little something. I don't think any of you, well, maybe a couple of you know this story. But I've been told that this is a true story, and that Lee Solid's going to give us an abbreviated version of this to start this. And I just call this Button, Who's Got the Button? Lee? And this predates Apollo.
I was going to say this is an old story. We tried to launch John Glenn several times, like 10. I think we only tucked him in the capsule 4 times, and on the 4th one, why we managed to launch him. And after the launch, my company, we had the rocket engines on the Atlas vehicle. We also had the engine control panel in the blockhouse, and we were smart enough to know that start button was probably worth something. And since it was our panel, I decided that we would do some, quote, routine maintenance on that panel so as to capture that button. So I sent a technician out to the pad to bring the panel back, and we're going to capture that button. We get out there and we find nothing but a hole where the button was. The test conductor, as probably some of you know, he's long since gone. His name was Tom O'Malley. He was a real character, and if you knew him, I don't have to say any more. Obviously, he beat me to it. Anyway, if you want to see the button, it's in the museum up in Titusville.
Yeah, it's in the Titusville Museum, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I told you guys wouldn't have heard that story before about and it was years before they actually got the button back, right? Didn't it stay with O'Malley for a long, long time?
Yes, and his family donated it to the museum. Yes.
Yeah.
I touched it once.
Stephen, I wanted to ask you, the President Kennedy's charge that we would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, before the end of the decade, what did that mean to you, to the country? I mean, what was it?
So it really was a rallying cry. When he was growing up, he grew up in the era of kind of Buck Rogers. He went in the service. He believed in his brother was an aviator and big adventure. During the 50s, when he was a senator, our country was falling behind on technology. And so it was a big issue for him. And he knew we had to be ahead in technology. And he wanted to go to the moon, but he also wanted to use it as a way to galvanize. At Rice University, when he said we're going to go to the moon and do those other things, we didn't call it STEM education back then, but he understood that was so important. And the thousands of inventions that, including some of the people on this panel and people in this room, have the spin-offs that have come up. You know, it's important to keep in mind, when the Kennedy administration was started, NASA was a very small agency, 2 years old. The first 17 people that they interviewed turned the job down because they described it as a do-nothing agency, wasn't going to go anywhere, had a small budget, didn't have a mission, wasn't clear if it would be moon or not. And so it wasn't until the 18th candidate, and John Kennedy, against the advice of his staff, said, I'm going to interview that candidate, trying to be James Webb. And James Webb initially said he didn't really want it, but President Kennedy can be very persuasive when your president asks you to do something. So he really believed in this, and it was bigger than him. Obviously, he didn't live to see it, but something that we accomplished as a world and as a combined nation.
And Al, you're right in the middle of it, obviously. A part of it.
Yeah, I was alive then.
Were you alive then?
Yeah, I was alive then.
Yeah.
I was a young guy.
You certainly were.
But you know, most people I run into today weren't born till after I made my flight.
Yeah. Well, that's what I want to ask. Now, following up on what Stephen said, did you guys feel, I mean, were you just doing a job, or did you understand the pressure? What had been asked of you guys?
Well, you know, there are all kinds of famous stories about what the program meant back then, but I will tell you that the huge difference between the program then and now is that then we had no bureaucracy. We all had that goal of going to the moon, and everybody was kind of on their own. I, as an astronaut, could get an airplane anytime to go anywhere I wanted, but I never abused that privilege because we were so goal-oriented about getting to the moon. So we did what we had to do. We pretty much had a free rein to do what we want to do, which is completely the opposite of the way it is today. So I think that JFK started something, and it may be the only time in history where a single individual created such an enormous, successful program on time. And I think he understood what was going on. But I also have to say, I think there's another thing. We don't talk about this much, Steve, but I also believe that he had kind of a handle on technology development. I think that was critical to the program. I think it's critical to us today. The technology we developed to do the Apollo program is the technology that filtered down into commercial manufacturing that made this country so successful financially over the last 30 years. And that's this kind of thing that we need to face up to today and do something about.
Did you feel any personal, were there pressures on you personally and living down here, working on the Space Coast? Was it any different for you guys?
Well, it didn't, John, it didn't affect me until I got into program in '66. And John Kennedy made that announcement back in 1961. So there was like 5 years between one and the other. And I was flying into fighter squadron out of Washington, D.C. at the time. And we had a lot of fun with that because we tried to convince one of our flight leaders that he was being selected as an astronaut, which is a big lie, but we had a lot of fun with it for a while. I have to tell you a little side story. We were sitting in the pilot's lounge one day, and Shepard was about ready to launch. Well, about the time that he was ready to launch, we had one of our aircraft that was up on a maintenance flight, checking out some maintenance that had been done, and they had a problem with it, and they had to do an emergency landing. So we're sitting in the pilot's office drinking coffee and saying, what are we going to do? We're going to watch Shepard launch, or we're going to go out and watch Major McIntyre crash? Well, we decided to take our marshmallows and go out to the runway and watch him crash, because we could always see Shepard launch 10 times afterwards, you know? No problem, it was all on TV. So this is the kind of thing that the program did back in the 60s.
So I see there wasn't much pressure on you guys at all.
No pressure.
No, none at all. You spent a lot of time, though, both of you, Lee, you too, here on the Space Coast, as we call it now. A different place back then than it is now?
Well, there was a lot of activity. I got here first in 1960, so I'm here 2 years by the time John Kennedy gives us the challenge to go to the moon. And I was working the Atlas program, and by the way, on Alan Shepard's flight, I went home and got my little 8mm movie camera, and of course we couldn't bring cameras onto the base. So I went out on the jetty, and I have an 8mm shot of Alan Shepard's flight, by the way. It's so bleached out you can't really see much anymore. But it was exciting times, but it seemed like we were launching something just about every day. And you know, you always went out to look, no matter whose vehicle it was or who was involved in it, because more than likely, I shouldn't say more than likely, probably 50% of the time you were going to see some fireworks. And so everybody made it out to watch the launches in those early days.
Wasn't there one that took a left turn and just about went over everybody's heads, and they were down by the bunker or something, was there?
Well, the one that got us all excited was that it was a Titan, and almost immediately it went horizontal. Yeah. And I happened to be standing on the structure that was being built at Pad 34 for the Saturn I program, and I happened to be standing on that structure, seeing that thing coming down ICBM row. Now, that was a little exciting. Of course, range safety blew it, so those of us that were in places we shouldn't have been anyway had a little exciting time, yes.
Duck and cover?
Yes.
Suzy, let me ask you, bring you into this, on the, talking about communications. You had talked about communications, and when you look at communicating the message, right? What the space agency's message is today. Is it difficult to get that message out? I mean, clearly when you're on social media and places like that, I see all of the space crowd always, but to broaden the message of what NASA's accomplishing, what they intend to accomplish, difficult task to do?
I think that social media has actually helped us with that, because back when I first came here, I mean, we don't get money to advertise. And I remember giving a talk in New York shortly after the shuttle program ended, and I remember calling to get a car, and the guy goes, "Oh, NASA's closed." I'm like, "No, it's not, you know?" And so when I talked to people in New York, I explained to them, there are 6 people, they're still, the space station's still up there, it's still flying over in that. So I really think social media has helped us with that, to be able to share that kind of information, because it's, you know, again, we don't get that advertising budget. And Bridenstine tweets everything that we do, so I mean, all the successes and everything.
He's not the only one.
Well, no, a lot of people are tweeting, but I'm saying,
he does a lot.
Yeah, but he's definitely one of our first administrator I know that's been tweeting as much as he has been, so yeah.
But you know, when you had John F. Kennedy and the message of we're going to the moon before the end of the decade, that was a lot easier to spur inspiration. Now it's like Artemis, we're going to back to the moon in 2024. But the Kennedy message was really, it's harder to be inspirational today than it was, obviously, in the Apollo days, right?
Yeah, yes, I agree. Again, because, it's more about why are we going, what are we doing, explaining that we're going back to not just go there, but to go there and stay, because there are resources on the moon that we need, and why we're going on to Mars. But yeah, with Kennedy, I believe it was like you said, it was a push. It was a military. It was a lot of, a lot of reasons behind it.
Right. We're going to get into that too in a minute or so.
Yeah.
Stephen, when the challenges then that we needed to overcome to make that dream a reality, they were enormous. I don't think a lot of people understand the magnitude of the challenges.
They were in every element. So just take technology. We're at a university that has great technology training. There was no college back then that had computer science major. The word software hadn't been invented. The alloys we needed for the capsule, some of those hadn't been invented. So we had to invent things just to learn how to invent things. Some of the first grants for computer science came from NASA. So there were technological challenges, financial challenges. NASA started as a very small agency. President Kennedy and Congress spent a lot of money, so it got to be to put it in context, today the defense industry spends around 4.5% of the federal budget. Back then NASA was spending about 4.5% of the federal budget. So in context, there's a famous story where President Kennedy's father, Ambassador Kennedy, once wrote to his son saying, I can't believe what you're doing. You're going to bankrupt the country. Because it was very controversial, because we didn't know if we'd be successful. So they were financial, they were political, building an infrastructure to eventually get to 400,000 people working at NASA and universities and private sector, and a belief, because there were obviously challenges along the way. You talked about some of the challenges. Some of the jokes in the early days was there was Sputnik in Russia, and we had Kaputnik, because it didn't quite always go.
Kaputnik. I've been seeing a lot of promotions for a new series that's coming on Amazon or somebody where it's like the Russians get there first. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm not sure how to take that, but it seems pretty interesting. So
there's also an Apollo 18 movie.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Where bugs get them.
Yeah. And then there's the movie about where you guys did the whole thing on the soundstage in.
That was Capricorn 1.
Capricorn 1, right?
The movie. They killed off everybody except one guy.
Oh. See, now we're doing movies.
And he showed up at his own funeral.
What? So how did it get done? Why did it get done? I remember many years ago at CNN interviewing for an Apollo anniversary piece, Rocco Petrone, right? And Rocco said the one thing I will never forget. He said it was all about Apollo, power and might, period. That's what the driving force was. Who was going to be king of the mountain? Was it going to be the USSR at the time, or was it going to be the United States? You guys all want to chime in there. Go ahead, anybody. Bob.
Well, recall the clip we just saw where President Kennedy said this is going to be hard. Okay, well, one of the things he was alluding to when he initiated this great adventure was it's going to be hard to accept the risk that we're going to invest the equivalent of billions of dollars, and we may lose. They may beat us. They may get there first, or we may not get there at all, but we're going to have to accept that risk of the prestige to our society because this is worth the effort. And what goes along with that is the things that Steve alluded to. Well, we're going to have to make hard decisions about budgets and money. There's other demands on the money that our capital generates in this country, but we're going to allocate that to the space program. It's going to be hard to accept the risk, not only to astronauts who have to accept the most risk in this, but people that do processing on the ground. There's hazards involved with this, and schedule-wise, you got to accept the fact that we may not make it by the end of the decade. And he has essentially initiated a 10-year marathon for a workforce that was working around the clock 7 days a week. So it's a large risk assessment had to be understood, but proceed anyway. And in hindsight, there was you mentioned empowerment, and Al did also. Well, as a journeyman engineer, Bobby here could, I'm making $10,000 a year, something like that. I can sign sole source purchase requests for up to $50,000 on a couple of sentences of sleazy justification in my signature, and this is mid-60s. You couldn't do that today because of, well, you can call it bureaucracy, but the rules just don't allow you to do that. So a lot of risk had to be accepted, but a famous American once said, well, if you're on a venture where there's risks involved and you can accept those risks after you've understood them, then stop worrying about it, just go do it. Amelia Earhart.
Al? I'd just like to make a comment following up on what Steve said. Times have changed. When JFK announced in 1961 that we're going to go to the moon, there were a lot of factors that helped him make that decision and push it through. He had the country behind him to begin with. He had Congress behind him. Both sides of the aisle were behind him to do that. The American people were so concerned about Sputnik and about Yuri Gagarin going into space that they almost insisted that we got to do something to overcome all that, okay? Contrast that with what's going on today, where we have a president who will never get an extra dollar from Congress unless somebody dies. We are so divided today. We're not unified behind one cause like we were when JFK was president. Notwithstanding the fact that he was a very, very charismatic president and could see clearly what a space program would do for this country. And I think that we've lacked that in the years since then. But I think today we've got a problem because we got a president on one side, and we got Congress that is doing everything they can to get rid of him, and not looking at what's really important to this country, like sponsoring a space program.
I was just going to add that this was a real commitment. I mean, a commitment that had basically a blank check behind it. And that made it real. It wasn't a wish, it wasn't a dream, it was a real commitment. And even the working level people sensed that. We talked about the competition with the Russians. The working level person didn't see that as a competition. I've said before, my enemy was not the Russians. My enemy was December 31st, 1969. The motivation to meet the challenge and make it happen. We made decisions that were higher risk decisions because we lost a year and a half with the Apollo 1. We had to make that back somehow and still make the goal. And so, it was a different world for the working level people because we knew we were part of something big, something historic, something really important. And we had to work at making it happen, and it was easy because the commitment was there from, as you say, from the bottom to the top.
When John Kennedy ran against Richard Nixon, during one of the debates, Richard Nixon famously met with Khrushchev as vice president and was very proud that we had developed color TV back then. And John Kennedy said in one of the famous lines, you can keep the color TV, I want the American flag to land on the moon first. And then in April, so he was sworn in January of '61. In April, I'm going to read you one sentence of a memo he wrote to the then vice president, where he's talking about NASA, and he said, are we working 24 hours a day on existing programs? If not, why not? And if not, will you make recommendations how the work can be speeded up right away? So he was absolutely committed to that, to beat them. But then at the end of it, in '63, President Kennedy reached out to Khrushchev and said, why don't we go to the moon together and build it? Khrushchev turned it down because his son later, when he was speaking at the Kennedy Library, said, because his father understood then that in fact the Russians were behind, but he didn't want to show, if they worked together, he'd have to kind of let them in the tent, so to speak. But now we obviously have an International Space Station, we're doing things together in many ways, but so it went from beating the Russians being the motivation, as was said, and really a rallying cry. And again, for the young people here, I don't think many people understand that the basic technology that we use today, from the Weather Channel, the internet, GPS, I mean, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of things that wouldn't have happened. The first time a computer could do two things at once was part of the space program.
So the working level folks really didn't have the one eye on the Russians. That was the upper levels at NASA and the politicians, et cetera, et cetera. You guys were just doing your job, and your deadline was December 31st, 69. Al?
Yeah, pass.
Pass?
I was going to say something, but I won't.
Go ahead. Oh, please. See, he does that to me all the time.
Now we want to hear it, Al.
He leaves me hanging.
That's right. I try to.
All right. All right. So, to follow up on that, we were talking a lot about risk, right? Far more acceptant of risk back then, certainly, than during shuttle, and certainly now. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and a good example would be the Apollo 8 mission. As Lee alluded to, it was only a year before that, a year and some months, that Apollo 1, and we had the tragic accident on the launch pad. The Saturn V rocket had flown 2 unmanned missions, less than 100% successful, by the way, as this rocket scientist could elaborate on. Yet only a few months after Apollo 7 went into orbit in low Earth orbit and essentially functionally tested an Apollo spacecraft, our leadership said, we're going to the moon with Apollo 8 on this less than proven Saturn V rocket, on the spacecraft that has never seen the trip to the moon and back, and engineers are still looking at the data from the mission just a couple of months before, but we're going to the moon on Apollo 8. And it was a very successful. I don't feel that kind of courage exists in our current leadership. Perception,
John,
admittedly.
I agree with Bob. I think the biggest gamble NASA took was Apollo 8. Because if the same thing had happened to Apollo 8 that happened to 13, we would not have gotten the crew back, okay? No question about it. But the point I think I'd like to make is that I'm not sure we would have gotten to the moon at all, no matter what we did, if we didn't have a superior German engineering group in this country to put it all together. Now, I don't know whether, Lee, you'd agree with that or not, but I think that German group that von Braun brought to this country is the key that made it possible for us to be successful within the 10 years.
Lee, you want to add to that? No?
No, he's right.
Right. Stephen?
No, I think that was also very controversial because, Wernher von Braun, in terms of the Second World War, some people called him a war criminal. The United States signed an agreement. They called it Operation Paperclip, where Wernher von Braun and several of his engineers, they loaded up a trailer car full of plans, hid it in the forest. Wernher von Braun's brother went and found an American soldier who almost shot him, not a Russian soldier, not because they figured that they had the best chance, and the U.S. developed a program they called, instead of prisoner of war, a POP, a prisoner of peace. So brought Wernher von Braun and the 100, I don't remember exactly the number, over, first to Texas and then to Huntsville, and they were brilliant, but politically that was controversial. John Kennedy met Wernher von Braun in 1953, and they became professional. They very much respected each other, despite some of his liberal friends, John Kennedy's liberal friends, feeling he shouldn't be associated with him. So that was another area of risk.
Al, we talked once about, not that long ago, you and I had a discussion about Apollo 13 and then Apollo 17 being the last, right? And can talk to this too, Stephen, that you believed that they canceled 18 and 19 and 20 because they started to get cold feet because, right? I mean, the worst thing that could have happened is you lose
one.
Right? You lose one.
I've always that's my own personal opinion. I know that there were public reasons for canceling the program because we wanted to put the money in the shuttle program, which is never a program that I liked. I thought it was the most dangerous thing we ever did. But I always kind of thought there was another reason for dropping the program at that point, and that is we had 6 very successful landings on the moon. What's the worst thing that could happen? We could lose a crew. And if we lost a crew, all the good things that those 6 landings did would be forgotten. So I believe there was a little chicken played back in those days by NASA and the government. I don't know, whether you were there, you were involved in a lot of those things back in those days, and whether you agree with that assessment or not, but I've always felt that.
No, I agree with that. We had done everything that we could do with the 6 flights. The next flight, another location, another batch of rocks, maybe another experiment or 2 we could leave behind. But hey, we had done what we set out to do. To go further is risky. Now, I'm a rocket engine guy. You know, a rocket engine is a controlled explosion. If you lose control, all you have left is explosion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, by the way, that particular mentality motivated us rocket engine guys, because we recognized that we probably, if we had a bad day at the pad, it probably would be because of an engine failure. And we didn't want to be the guy that had the engine failure. So, shutting the program down, gave us a certain amount of confidence that, hey, we had done all that we could do. We don't need to risk anymore at this point for what the ultimate purpose was.
Coming from a different direction, recall on Apollo 17, which ended up being the last mission, we sent an astronaut who was also a scientist, Jack Schmidt, to capture out of that program and those landings, to start to capture some of the science of what we were doing as opposed to the flag and footprints, so to speak. And I looked at that as saying, okay, now we're getting on with what should be the next phase of a space program, be it Apollo or whatever it was going to be. So to me, not only, of course, it was a bummer when that was the cutoff of the program, and a lot of friends that had, the population of Brevard County went down like this. Population of the Kennedy Space Center dropped by 50% in a period of a few months. But the loss to me was, well, is this the end of the real exploration? One scientist, one trip to the moon, and that's it. Sure, we're sending satellites and whatever out there, and we're learning more about us and our universe, but real scientific endeavors, is that it? So I looked at it a little differently. Yeah, I understand the risk type thing, but...
John, to me, it's kind of interesting. Back when they canceled 18, 19, and 20, we were all pretty upset. There goes our chance. Now I look back on it 40, 50 years later, and we've got a gorgeous display at KSC of the Saturn V. We have one at Huntsville, and we have one in Houston. We've got those 3 launch vehicles on display that are going to excite generation after generation in the future. And now I'm kind of benign about canceling those 3 because I think what's happened is really, really good.
It was more positive for the future because they didn't fly.
Yeah, exactly. Right. They're going to have more to do with motivating young people into STEM courses than if they had flown and they weren't around. I think that's been a good thing, even though at the time we thought it was terrible.
Suzy?
That's kind of how I feel about the orbiters. The same way. When the shuttle program ended, I mean, it was sad, but I do feel the same way, that they are there to inspire, and that we were able to send them out and they have stories to tell. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, Suzy, you know, Bob was just talking about Harrison Schmitt, Jack Schmitt, being the scientist who finally went on 17, the geologist who goes. So, I mean, back then, it was clearly, it was an afterthought, right? I mean, and universities, what kind of role, you know, did they even play back in the day? Not that you're old enough to necessarily remember.
Thank you, because I was 6 years old when Neil and Buzz walked on there.
Don't rub it in. But from the standpoint that science was not, universities were not the critical institutions involved with space as they are today, right? I mean, it was as new to them as it was to the country.
Yeah, but I think from the university perspective that they still were the ones to help to teach the skills to all of those who've been in the space program, the technicians, the engineers, the rocket scientists. And for me, for my degree here at Florida Tech, it was unique because I got my master's in space systems operations after I got my bachelor's in aerospace engineering from University of Missouri-Rolla, which was a basic engineering degree. Here, my classes were actually taught at Kennedy Space Center by some people who worked out there. And it was all geared toward what we were doing at the time for operations. So to me, it was, you know, FIT particularly played a really great role as far as helping those of us on the Space Coast when I was here. So.
Stephen?
So I think, as I said earlier, the first grants for computer science came from NASA. You know, there were meetings early on when President Kennedy, he would go to briefings and they'd say, well, we don't have computer scientists. He said, well, then let's fund them. So he was thinking, if you can't solve the problem today, let's get people, and 2, 4, 6 years later, they'll be learning from that. I can't talk about, obviously, what happened later on, but early on, John Kennedy was willing to live with more risk. I mean, PT-109, he lost crew members. He almost lost his own life. Unfortunately, his brother was lost in World War II. You know, the most serious thing a president does is send people into harm's way. So it's not like he took it lightly, but he understood to take big accomplishments, to really, it had been that under Eisenhower we had kind of an incremental strategy, kind of looking at the next incremental thing. And John Kennedy developed what he called a leapfrog strategy, is saying, let's look at the next big thing, kind of that's where sending the man to the moon. And he understood in that process that there would be risk, but he also took political risks. There were several famous meetings with civil rights leaders in late '61 and early '62 where they were complaining that President Kennedy wasn't spending enough on housing or urban development or other things that were equally important because of all the growth in NASA. So if you look at President Kennedy's legacy, he was a great civil rights leader, but at that snapshot, there were competing interests that he was willing to kind of push on.
You know, we were in the back before we got started, and we were talking, and we were kind of just talking about the fact that Boeing had their test, you know, the pad abort test yesterday, day before yesterday, and that only 2 of the 3 chutes deployed. Now, I mean, is the mentality today because of of that? I mean, are they going to have to jump through far more hoops than you guys would have had to jump through in the past?
Well, from an engineering standpoint, the engineers would look at the test yesterday from the standpoint, we, the engineering team, designed the system so that 3 parachutes would deploy. It's the way we designed it, that's the way it's supposed to work. Now, being good engineers, we put redundancy in our design. So if one of them doesn't deploy for whatever reason, and that we may or may not ever understand, but their goal will be to understand it, the crew will still be safe when they land. So as an engineer, the way I look at that is, well, in some respects it's a failure because I designed it for 3 and only 2 did it. On the other hand, from a risk standpoint, It's you can accept the risk of one of them failing and knowing that the crew will still be safe. Now, and without getting into specifics, I got to look at all the data, right, and see if the landing loads and the G-forces and that sort of thing would really be safe for an astronaut. But will it be more difficult to get through the system today than it was 50 years ago if the similar thing would happen? The short answer is yes.
Bob, it just seems to me like we are much more risk averse today than we were 50 years ago. And I think a little bit of that is good because these guys in private industry like Elon and Jeff Bezos and those kind of people, Elon Musk in particular, I think, tend to cut a little corner here and there to get something done and launch when he wants to launch and all that kind of thing. And I think it's good that NASA has oversight of a lot of that stuff, that they're keeping them honest. But I'm not sure that that oversight is a little too heavy-handed, that kind of stymies some of the developments that the greater the reward, the greater the risk is my attitude. I think Apollo 8 was a great risk-reward issue back in the day, that we were really going to do it, and the reward was phenomenal because it opened up the lunar landing program from then on. And today I see we're backing off a little bit from that kind of risk-taking. We want everything to be safe. And if you're going to be safe, it's probably not going to be very good. I mean, if you always want to be safe, you may not get much done.
Well, when we're looking at the delays in all these programs, whether it's SLS, whether it's Musk flying space station with commercial crew, I mean, a lot of that is very likely due to all of the built-in, and Suzy, you can probably address this, so much more safety that has to be addressed before
yeah, John,
you put
but then
humans in there,
something
right?
happens that makes that safety issue come right to the forefront when SpaceX did a pad abort on their Dragon spacecraft and that thing blew up. Okay, yeah. They need to find that out. So that test was a good, valid test.
Anybody else want to chime in on that, Bob? Any more?
No, except that it's human spaceflight, and as a young engineer and being indoctrinated by the older engineers, when I first came on board with NASA, it was made perfectly clear to us that, Bobby, fine, you're responsible for this part of this system on the Gemini spacecraft, and you're going to learn by doing, but when you're not sure, stop, get advice, and never lose sight of the fact that what this is all about is the crew and their mission. It's not about the rocket, it's not about the spacecraft, it's not about your little component, it's all about the crew and their mission. Never lose sight of that, the number one priority.
Lee?
In the whole development process of flight hardware, you learn more from a failure than you do from the success unless you're smart enough to evaluate every success to the same level that you would evaluate the failure. You know, and you know, because the data is telling you something in every test, and so you take advantage of that. But I was going to make a point. One of the reasons that we were able to pull this whole thing off in 6 years, the challenge came in 62, 63, we were really starting to get going here, and we pulled this off in 6 years. And as a rocket engine developer, I don't think we ever developed a rocket engine in less than 8 years, but we managed to develop those, and because we were driven. And just the fact that we had a commitment, we had a challenge, this sort of released the creative juices in people, the normal person. You know, we had to come up with some new materials because we were dealing with temperatures and pressures and vibration loads and all that sort of thing. We had to come up with new sensors, and we had to come up with a lot of things. And so this forced the development of technology. And we should have learned from that, because we've done an awful lot of studying. You know, this current path we're on, going back to the moon, we've studied this to death. You know, I'm still not sure that You know, we're going to use a gateway, right? You know, well, where do you go from the gateway?
That's a whole different thing, Lee.
I realize that. We've studied this thing to death. Well, when this challenge came, I'm sure Wernher von Braun said, hey, we've got to go with what we know. You look at that big rocket sitting out there, you know, it looks like a little rocket, tanks and a rocket engine at the bottom. You know, they didn't study this to death because they didn't have time. You know, we could have studied assembling in orbit and going from there. We could have studied the dickens out of it. But von Braun had to say, we got to go with what we know. And so that big vehicle out there looks just like those little vehicles. It's just a whole lot bigger, you know. And so that decision was made. So this is not really new technology in it, except where it was forced, and things like sensors and so forth. But anyway, I think, you know, we should learn from that process of setting a kind of a stretch goal and force the technology development into the goal. But we didn't do that. And here we are, we're still studying, you know, what options to take.
So there's a few other interesting things to think about. Again, back in the 60s, President Kennedy decided that we were going to be very transparent. So, and that, again, that adds risk, but his hope was, when successful, that would add momentum. So the Soviets, there were lots of failures they had that their public didn't know about. President Kennedy said, okay, if we're going to be transparent, let's get the most out of it. So he planned announcements and rose garden ceremonies and ticker tape parades and all those things to kind of build momentum. And there were, because he said at some point we're going to have problems, we have to build the support. He also had to build the political support. And so, you know, why is NASA in some of the key places it is? If you look back then, where were the key committee chairmen, and they were mostly men back then, you know, whether it be in Dallas or in Houston or in Huntsville or whatever, he understood where kind of the appropriations. There's, as a joke is, there's no Buck Rogers without the Bucks, and he had to get the money to do that.
You mentioned, Al, that a lot of these younger people weren't even around when you flew to the moon, but were we...
No, we did it in Arizona.
That's right, I forgot. Capricorn 1. That's right. He was a good actor. I liked him, the guy that played that. What the heck was his name? Anyway. Were we spoiled from the standpoint that Kennedy, his challenge, we did it, we got there on time. And now, today, on the other hand, we've become so acceptant of delay after delay. I mean, shuttle last flew in 2011, and here we are in 2019, and we are years behind getting humans, astronauts, to the space station on our own vehicles. We're years behind on the Space Launch System. Have we just become so acceptant now of, oh, well, oh, and Artemis, we're going to the moon in 2024. Uh-huh. Really? I mean...
Well, John, I'll tell you, I'll be a heretic here and say something that maybe I shouldn't say, but I think it all boils down to leadership at the top. I think JFK was a leader. He was a visionary. He did the right things. He had the right support. We've not had that since then. I don't think we've had it, particularly in the last 10 years. We have really pushed space off to the side. We've pulled the teeth from the space program and made it something that's just kind of so-so, hum-hum kind of thing. And I think we're seeing a president that's kind of trying to bring it back, but he doesn't have the individual qualities that Kennedy had that really set the country on edge and made it work. And he's got a Congress that's against him. So I think it's going to be a while before we see any real activity, excitement like we had back in the 60s with the lunar landing. I think it's going to be a while before we see that again, because we got to get the right people in the right places that provide the right kind of leadership to see that those things get done.
But is it okay to be acceptant of these artificial deadlines and you know, these goalposts that are out there that are never achieved.
Well, if you can't meet a deadline, you might as well not have one.
Why bother? Right. I mean, that was kind of my point. Why are we setting all of these goalposts?
It's leadership, John. It's downright leadership. Why is the SLS so late and so over budget? Why is Orion so late and so over budget? Why is all of this being delayed and delayed and delayed? And I tell you what, it's leadership. I'm sorry, it's leadership.
And Bob?
Well, yes, leadership, it is because of the sustained commitment that President Kennedy was able to put together when he initiated it, and it carried through, what, 3 different administrations, and regardless of how much money we asked for as NASA, we got it. Yeah. We got it. Said, well, we want to keep on track for 69. We need more of this, and we got it. Commercial Crew Program, Al didn't mention, when in its initial phase of startup, right after the last shuttle flight. If you go back and do the history, the first 3 or 4 years of that program, NASA got between half and 2/3 of the amount of money it asked for to keep on track with what was going to be the first crewed flight in 2015, 16, 17, somewhere in there. The commitment was not there from the top.
We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. Let me ask a couple last quick questions for you. Between the time of shuttle and the time of Saturn V and flying shuttle, I mean, a lot had to change from the hardware standpoint, the technical standpoint. I mean, Lee, you and Bob can probably address this. I mean, that had to be an enormous, enormous challenge.
Well, from an engineer's standpoint, me and my colleagues, we had to go back to school and learn what computers and software were. Really, I mean, my engineering degree was based on 1950s technology, electrical engineering. It was vacuum tubes. Transistors had just been invented. A chip in the dictionary was something you carved off a block of wood. I mean, really. So when we'll call it the downtime at the end of the Apollo, we went back to school. They had programs at the Space Center to teach us what a computer was and what software was. I actually took courses here at FIT to, again, we were so busy working around the clock 7 days a week, we didn't have time to catch up with technology that was going into orbit quicker than we were. And the other is the concept of reusability. And the Apollo program was easy for engineers. Everything was factory fresh, brand new. It looked like new. It had to act new. And once it flew, we retired it. Now we're going to have to get used to what was referred to as the airline concept for something that hasn't just flown at 30 to 40,000 feet. It was up there at 200, 300 some miles. Different challenge.
Oh, I can't add to that except that I beat Bob here by 2 or 3 years, and when I got here, we were still using slide rules.
All right, some final thoughts? We're just about out of time. Suzy, you want to start it off? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. We can start with Al, because he never, ever is lack of words.
So for me, I've always loved shuttle. So I was the first set of new hires here after Challenger, and I actually took a pay cut to come here. And it was all about what it was. I mean, I was 6, like I said, when the moon landing happened, but I always had a love of space and airplanes and knew I wanted to be an engineer. But I also wanted to be a singer, but I didn't want to be a starving artist, so I chose to get an engineering degree and sing on the side. So, but yeah, coming here, as soon as I came here, one of the things we found out, I guess, from shuttle was that there weren't enough NASA engineers at the time. And when I came here, it was just my boss who was working thermal protection, and I was like, bam, go out on the floor. You're now the lead for return to flight for thermal protection on orbiter discovery. So like Bob was saying, you get out there, you hit the ground running. I learned to talk to the technicians. I learned to listen to the people, because sometimes they're doing things that aren't by the books and they're not telling you. And if you talk to them and you have a problem, then you can fix it and get things done right. I learned to, like Bob was saying, speak up, ask questions. I actually worked for Bob. He was my boss at one time. So don't be afraid to ask questions. And I still have a love. I've been here 33 years, and I still love seeing fire and smoke, and hearing the rumble, and hearing the sonic booms when we come back for landing. Even though they're not on NASA launches anymore, I'm excited about the whole commercial aspect of everything. And I am too looking forward to us launching U.S. astronauts on U.S. rockets from U.S. soil again here soon.
So I am an incurable optimist, and I think we can recapture the leadership. It's important to keep in mind, you're talking about the number of people alive when Al flew, so 80% of the people in the United States were born after the Kennedy administration, 80%. I meet young people all the time, because I do lots of tours and stuff, who say, oh, we've always been on the moon, because it's just something part of their context. So I believe we can do great things again. Again, if you go to the JFK website, we have something called JFK Moonshot. It's an app that you can download and kind of learn more about this. So I'm excited. I appreciate, again, Florida Tech's leadership in this, and it's a pleasure to be here today.
So we pontificated about how we got to the moon 50 years ago using old math and crude equipment and whatever, and today the tools that are available are order of magnitude more sophisticated. I have more electronics in my pocket than all of the computers combined in the spacecraft we went to the moon. So we learned by doing, and for the most part had to use this. But my message to the folks out there that now have access to all of this electronics, don't forget how to Google your brain.
I'll take a little different tack from the standpoint of looking at space exploration and all of the various aspects of it as a career. And I encourage kids. I do a little docent work out at Sat 5, and I chose a Saturday because that's the day there's more kids. And I look forward to talking with the ones who really have good questions about the space program, because I want to encourage them to get involved in it. I've been involved in it my whole life. I wouldn't trade my career for anything in the world. Just the aspect of as a test engineer, life becomes a series of short-term goals. Our short-term goal is a successful test. And when you accomplish that test, why, it's met in all the splendor of smoke and fire and rumble and so forth. And then, bingo, you go on to the next short-term goal. And launching things, when the company decided to send me down here to help fly things in 1960, my short-term goals just changed to the next flight. And you go through these series of short-term goals, and the satisfaction you get from a success in what we do in this whole arena called space exploration. So I really encourage kids to get involved in this business. It's exciting. It's honorable. I mean, what can you say negative about being involved in the space exploration activity?
Al, you want to take us home?
Let me just tag on to what Lee's saying. I've thought a lot about this since I made a flight to the moon, and it keeps coming back to a question. Why do we have a space program? Why do we go somewhere? Why do we go to the moon? Why are we trying to go to Mars? And I've developed my own personal philosophy about that it's a thing called survival of the species. I happen to believe that way in the distant future, this place that we live on is going to be untenable. We know that. That's a fact. The sun's going to burn out its energy. What are we as a human species, as an intelligent species, doing in the meantime? We're getting ourselves ready to go somewhere else. We don't even know it. I think it's a genetic drive in us, and we've taken a few very small steps going to the moon, going to Mars. That is not the solution. The solar system is not the solution for the human species. Our solution is somewhere else. So we have got to work more and more and more on how do you get to very distant Proxima B, okay? 4.2 light years away. At our current speeds, it'll take us only 40,000 years to get there, okay? We've got to improve that. We've got to do something about that. But to me, that's the whole underlying cause of the space program is our survival. And these young kids that we're giving scholarships to are going to be the instruments that are going to make that possible. And that's why I'm so proud of these kids, and so I'm so proud of the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation for doing that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm round of applause for our panel. That was terrific. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Suzy. Bob. Lee? Al? Always a pleasure, buddy. You did it again. Al was just talking about this 40,000 years, and I remember interviewing Harrison Schmitt, Apollo 17, and one of his things was that we would have to have these generational spacecraft because we'd never approach the speeds we needed, and so generations would be born, grow up, and die, and be buried in deep space on the way to one of these new planets, because that was just the way it was going to have to be. So now, I want to introduce our second panel. Andy Aldrin, Director, the Aldrin Space Institute at Florida Tech. Andy? Saida Caballero Nieves, Assistant Professor, Aerospace Physics and Space Sciences at Florida Tech. Saida? David Kring, Principal Scientist, Lunar and Planetary Institute, USRA. Sean Quinn, Director of Engineering at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Sean? And Winston Scott, former Space Shuttle astronaut. Winston. So this panel is the now, and you folks all heard a little bit of the kvetching about the now, and I started with what are these artificial deadlines, what's the point, et cetera, if you can't meet the deadlines. So to all of you, and we'll start with you, Andy, where are we now? Is it a crossroads? I mean, what is it?
It is a crossroads. You could say that, we live in interesting times, and in some countries, China, that's a curse. I think in America, it's kind of a blessing. There are a lot of things that are kind of uncertain at this point, but there's both tremendous opportunity and tremendous risk. And so I would say that there are really two things that are happening. Most of the discussion so far has really focused on human spaceflight, but there's an awful lot that's going on in the rest of space. And specifically, let me talk about the potential for a transition to space systems, space programs that are dominated by private investment, right? And that has the potential for fundamentally changing the risk equation that we've been talking about, because we've seen already commercial capital is more than willing to accept risk. I mean, there are billions, I think about roughly $3 billion a year is getting spent on commercial space investments by private, whether it's venture capital, institutional capital, companies' own money. And that's not a huge amount, but it's still pretty significant. And to be sure, that money is at risk, and a lot of it's going to get lost. And that's just the way venture capital works. And so I think that creates lots of opportunities for innovation. And I'll be very honest that it's not clear that we are really going to make that transition or not. I think we have to be a lot smarter about how we do things. The second thing that's going on is really more along the lines of what we'll focus on NASA, what NASA is doing institutionally. And there, I think a lot of the panelists will address this, but we're doing a pretty good job of managing risk in terms of the science programs. I think that the competed missions are actually really dynamic, really productive, and I hope we can have a discussion about some of those because I think it's super productive. We tend to focus on what's happening with human spaceflight. And I think one of the aspects of risk in human spaceflight is that we haven't talked about is, so we go back and we look at NASA as an organization in the 60s. NASA functioned like probably the world's largest startup organization. There were literally amazing things going on. We all know the story about John Houbolt actually pushing through a decision to fundamentally change the mission design of the program. And you imagine that happening today. It's almost impossible. But it's actually more of a product of institutional aging than it is necessarily. I mean, to be sure, there are issues of leadership, but there's also just a natural process of institutional aging. Apple isn't the same as it was in 1980. IBM isn't the same as it was in the 1970s. NASA isn't the same. And so some of that has to be simply, the best way of getting out of it, I think, is doing some of the things that NASA is already doing in terms of sharing risk with the commercial sector, and I think there's opportunity there. But we've got issues that we need to work through, the sort of purely governmental programs, and that's just going to require a lot of hard work, I'm afraid.
Saeed, I knew we were just talking about human space flight, but from where you are as a professor, right? I mean, there's a lot more to the space program, the larger space program, under that giant tent than human space flight.
Correct. So a lot of so I'm going to admit, first of all, I'm actually of the generation that was born after the Apollo missions, so sorry about that. But it led to a lot of inspiration. I'm definitely of the shuttle generation and the Hubble generation, and that we've gone a lot more beyond just going to the moon, but we've gone into exploring our entire universe. We've now discovered new exoplanets, right? We've discovered planets outside of our solar system. And so by learning more about our own solar system, we can then learn about what our universe is like. And it's served as an inspiration, especially Hubble. Hubble's legacy has been completely outstanding, and a lot of the ability for Hubble to have lasted as long as it did has been because it's been actually serviceable, right? We've had several missions that gone up there, and you know, when Hubble first went up there, the images were a little hazy, and they adapted it and corrected for that. And the last servicing mission in 2008 has extended the life of Hubble much longer than was ever expected. And so I think there's a lot of hope for the future, a lot of progress. The next one that's coming up is James Webb in a few years. And that's
much delayed.
Much
James
delayed.
Webb.
But still really exciting in terms of the prospects of what we can do with this sort of not human exploration, but space exploration.
But students don't necessarily look the same as some of us outsiders. They look at the larger picture. They're not just looking at, oh, I want to be an astronaut. Oh, I want to fly. I mean, these students want to do this kind of science that you're talking about. I would assume you see more of that than you see of the students who are like, oh, yeah, I want to be the first person to walk on Mars.
Actually, we see both. We do see both. A lot of people are inspired by, you know, I mean, I was inspired. I grew up here in Florida, so I was inspired by seeing the shuttle launches on a routine basis. And even though I have no interest in going into space, I'm very, I admire those who have gone. It's really a very daunting prospect. But it's motivated me to learn more about our universe. There's so many questions that we don't understand. And so much when we do learn that we figure out there's more that we don't know.
David, do we see the, do we kind of downplay to some degree the challenges when it comes to autonomous flying vehicles that aren't, we don't give that as much. We see all the incredible things that the Jet Propulsion Laboratories accomplished with Mars land. Now we're going to do a helicopter on the next one, right? I mean, some of that stuff doesn't get the same level of fanfare and attention, clearly, as human spaceflight does. But it's tremendously important, and we accomplish a whole hell of a lot from all these unmanned space vehicles.
Well, yes, certainly the robotic space exploration program has been tremendous. It was actually initiated prior to the human exploration program. We actually had some robotic exploration of Venus and Mars, for example, before we landed on the moon. But I don't think that the inspiration of those robotic missions is ever going to eclipse what human exploration can do. And there's oftentimes a polarization of robotic exploration against human exploration that I don't think serves any of us very well. I think if you're going to have a healthy space exploration program, you have to have an integrated robotic and human exploration program. And that also means you have to really respect what the astronauts can do if they are given an opportunity to go back to the moon or onward to Mars. As was brought up in the previous panel, we finally did with Apollo 17, put a scientist on the lunar surface. And it is extraordinary what a human can do. You may go to a location with a plan in mind, but they land, they assess, they observe things. Things may be like they imagine, they may be vastly different than they imagine. In real time, they can make choices, they can reconfigure their plan and accomplish the objectives or additional objectives. I mean, there's actually a famous case during Apollo. During Apollo 16, the crew were going to land in a location and explore 2 types of volcanic provinces. They landed there, and John Young radioed back a little bit cryptically that things weren't as expected. And in fact, they collect 100% of the samples they collected were impact crater lithology. So there was not a volcanic rock to be found. But because they had been so well trained, had the ability to observe and make changes in real time, that mission was a huge scientific success.
Well, what are the challenges then that we're facing right now? Clearly there are great challenges as far as, getting back to the moon in 4 years, 5 years.
We've actually touched on, the previous panel touched on some of these issues. The one is that NASA used to be a Silicon Valley startup company, or akin to it. Now it's a big federal bureaucracy. And while some people, I guess yourself included, John, don't believe we can reach 2024, I think the Vice President's schedule has been very influential and had a very positive impact because it has forced people who are happy making PowerPoint briefing presentations to actually start producing product, making hard decisions. There's still a huge number of decisions that have to be made, but design decisions have to be made, things have to be built, we have to select and train new astronauts, we have to select and train new flight ops people. We have a workforce problem that's going to be difficult to overcome because none of the people, or very few of the people who have Apollo experience are alive, right? They're not in our ranks today. The expertise that we have is shuttle and station. We need to retrain the workforce to work on a planetary surface, and that is a vastly different environment. And having a 2024 goal, it may slip, but that is forcing people to make real progress. I think it's been very, very good.
Sean, do you see Dave was just mentioning the workforce issue. Now, you would probably see it from a couple perspectives. Working for government, when you can get all these people can go to private industry and make a lot more money.
Yeah, it's really amazing what's happened here in Brevard County since we flew the last shuttle mission in 2011. When I was driving up, from KSC this morning, and I was reflecting upon where we've come since 2011, and it's truly amazing. Yeah. I mean, we're on the cusp of sending an armada of spacecraft to the moon in ways that we haven't done since Apollo. And it's really incredible having NASA work with our commercial partners, with Commercial Crew, with Gateway, with the Human Landing Service, with SLS, with Orion. And the workforce in Brevard County is being stretched a little bit. We've advertised for NASA jobs, and unprecedented in my career, especially as a supervisor and director, we've actually had people turn down NASA jobs to go work for the private companies where historically it's been the opposite. So there's a lot of opportunity, a with companies like Blue Origin and SpaceX, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. And I applaud it. It's great. Yeah. It's great to be part of the space program right now. And I agree that the 2024 date is going to be tough, but that's what we're here for. That's what we're here for. And it will drive us to make decisions. It will drive us to deliver. And I can tell you the workforce that's at the Kennedy Space Center is completely behind what we're trying to do.
Winston, do you see it too, though, the idea that a lot of these younger people, younger generation, are opting to go to these commercial companies that seem to be full of energy and vigor, and you know, NASA maybe still has, and you can jump in on this too, NASA may still have this reputation of being kind of like old and stodgy, like me.
Absolutely. I do see that. For those who don't know, I'm on the faculty staff here at Florida Tech, so I get to interact with the students firsthand, and then I have a lucrative schedule that takes me around to other universities, so I get to interact with young people all the time. And yes, and I applaud that also. In fact, I encourage students that when they consider careers in aerospace, be it on the flying end, on the engineering, or whatever, they have a much broader range of opportunities than we did when I was coming along, and that the opportunities to get to space with one of the private commercial companies are as great, and maybe even greater, than with a government company. So I think it's really, really good. I like it. I define America's space program as being multifaceted. Used to be America's space program was only NASA, not anymore. NASA's a part of it, but then you've got Virgin Galactic, you've got SpaceX, you've got all the commercial crew part. Then you have the military part. You've got the Air Force right now, that's our lead military organization overseeing space, and then quite possibly we may see a Space Force. So I combine all of those various assets into America's space program, and that gives our young people a much broader range of opportunities to work in the space industry than we had when we were coming along.
Yeah, well, let me say one more thing. Given the competition we have in the workforce, and we have opportunities both in the private sector and with NASA, one thing will never change. We do this as a team. We've got NASA folks, we've got contractor folks, and together we form one space exploration team. And, when we have people that go to work for private industry, and then they come back to work for NASA, and maybe they're in a supervisor job or a director job, they can understand what it's like to be a contractor, or vice versa. Yeah. Occasionally we'll have NASA folks will decide to go to work for the contractor. And then when we have those different perspectives, we can form stronger relationships to make sure that we both succeed, because we live and die together. This is not a NASA versus a contractor thing. It never can be that. We're a team, and having this workforce move back and forth is only a good thing.
Andy, so is it better now? I mean, is this better? And any of you can jump in on this as well. Better to have NASA as one of the legs of the chair, as opposed to NASA being the whole darn chair, as it used to be. Is this make the space program stronger?
Well, absolutely. In fact, I don't think it's really a choice at this point. The idea that we would go back to a sort of almost an arsenal system that we had in the 60s, we won't be successful. And so the question is really going to come down to, over time, we want to be in a position where private capital is dominant in space. The government will buy those things which have only utility for the government, and everything else will be a product of commercial market forces. We're a long way from getting there now, and so I don't think it makes any sense to talk about turning the clock backward. The question is more, what's the clock speed going to be as it moves towards what's probably an inexorable movement toward more commercial private capital being invested in space ventures that are providing goods and services for private markets. That's where it's going. So it's really not a question of what's best. The question is really, how do we manage the transition, risk and the transition? Yeah.
Yes. So Apollo push to the frontier. They kind of showed us what's there. But if we're going to have a truly successful space exploration society, we need to have a mechanism, a set of mechanisms that allow that to be sustainable, okay? And that's not NASA landing on 13 more spots on the lunar surface. That's not a sustainable program. We need to take space exploration, take resource recovery. We need to develop a portion of our society that's actually utilizing space and making it commercially attractive. We need to take, a part of society with us. And that's why, it's built right into the Artemis program. We have right now selected a robotic mission. It's called Viper. That's supposed to land near the South Pole. It's began to initiate some investigations of where water ice or other types of volatile-bearing ices might exist. The hope is that those types of materials exist in quantities and in places that are recoverable. If so, that would be a resource that can be utilized not only on the lunar surface, but provide commercial opportunities beyond the moon. And so if we go out in a multifaceted commercial, government, academic way, we can make the scientific discoveries that at least I find very, very attractive, but we can also build the infrastructure that reduces costs, makes those scientific endeavors more attractive, at the same time providing other opportunities for other portions of society.
Jim?
Well, I think that the opportunities that lay before us with these commercial public the aerospace universe is changing before our eyes. But I don't want folks to forget that leveraging the commercial aerospace market actually started in 1999 with the robotic spacecraft. And for 20 years, the Launch Services Program has been procuring commercial services to launch some of the most important spacecraft that this nation has ever sent out to the outer solar system, including Pluto New Horizons, the Mars Curiosity rover, more recently the Parker Solar Probe to study the sun. So the idea of NASA and the government leaning more heavily on on commercial space isn't really new, but we're doing it more as we go into this new Artemis era of exploration. You look at the gateway acquisition strategies. We're issuing contracts to buy services where government is not taking ownership of the hardware. We are asking for a service where the commercial operator studies, designs, builds the hardware, and operates it, and the government is acting as a customer. So that evolution has already started and is going to play an important role as we move forward for exploring the moon and eventually to Mars.
I was having dinner with Alan Stern last week. He's the principal scientist for the Pluto New Horizons mission at a favorite Italian restaurant that I know up at Cape Canaveral. But shameless plug. But Stern, and now they're talking about a follow-on mission as part of the decadal studies, right? So important, again, one success breeds another opportunity.
Yeah, indeed. I had the opportunity to listen to his talk on the latest Pluto encounter as well, and they are indeed looking to plan a possible orbiter mission around Pluto soon.
So when we're talking about the commercialization of space, and we'll talk more about the future in the future, and we discuss, but the commercial companies out there, and the larger the role they take, and the more stuff that they're doing, does this to some degree render NASA becoming obsolete? Dare I say it? At some point, yeah, sure, we're going to send the science probes and we're going to have to go private. But even the private companies are saying, well, we're going to take humans to Mars. We don't need NASA to do that.
So I think the last two administrators have kind of had the same philosophy in mind, and that is NASA is there to do the pioneering work. And if the commercial companies can come in and fill in behind them, that's the way it should be. And we see that evolution occurring with station supply and resupply. So if NASA pioneers the way back to the moon, determines whether there are resources or not to be recoverable then the commercial companies can come in and utilize those resources, and NASA then set their eyes on the next goal, which might be Mars. So I think that that's a natural evolution. So I think that we need both. I mean, I just don't think we can move forward without both. Yeah.
I need to jump in. I agree we need both, but I do share a little bit of concern about NASA being relegated to the middleman role. And if you recall, just after Artemis was announced, there was a very, very brief period of time when I thought somebody said we're going to pause and reevaluate and see whether we, these are my words, need NASA involved at all, or do we just let the private companies go? It only lasted for a blip, and then it was gone. And then Artemis was back and in Gateway and so on. But that would be my concern. We need to be sure we keep a strong government-run program. You know, the cutting edge research, risky, esoteric stuff is all best done by governments because the government can afford it, they can direct it, and so on. The private sector's role is to come in and make it cost effective, make it affordable, make it repeatable, make it safer, and so on. I mentioned this team. I keep calling it America's Space. When you call it whatever you want to call it, because it's a team. But each member of the team brings certain strengths. You know, NASA has a strength, and that's the cutting edge stuff, the stuff that nobody else does. The commercial side has a strength, that's making it cost effective. The military has a side on it, that's keeping us safe. And there are people who are trying to militarize space. That we would be remiss if we didn't get ahead of the game and not be so reactionary. So everybody has a role, has a strength, and we do need to be sure that we maintain a strong government leadership in space. That's a strong NASA, my opinion.
Sean, did you mention?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One, we don't want to forget that NASA and the federal government is investing billions of dollars into the commercial partners for both Commercial Crew and Gateway. And so...
but that's going to be in the middleman, right?
Well,
exactly.
So let me add, you know, with human spaceflight, there is a strong heritage within the NASA engineering organization that has the experience through Apollo going into shuttle and ISS. And building new spacecraft is not an easy thing to do, all right, despite the most innovative minds in America working on it. And so, you know, the government engineers, some of the engineers that work for me, bring a heritage and experience that they're sharing with our commercial partners. And you notice I use the word partners. I'm not saying contractors. There are partners. We're in this together, and we're bringing and leveraging the strengths that we have as a government engineering team and applying it to Commercial Crew every day. I see it every day.
And just to reiterate, I think that's the point. We want to be sure we maintain that. If we lose that, if NASA, for example, is relegated to the role of only a middleman, the first thing you do when budgets get tight is you eliminate the middleman. And we want to be sure we keep what you're talking about. I agree with you. That's good. We want to keep it.
I can tell you, none of the engineers that work at the Kennedy Space Center feel like middlemen. They're in it to make it successful.
Yeah, so first of all, there will always be a government role for those places where there is a market failure. And with all due respect to Elon Musk, I think that settlements on Mars remain a market failure. There isn't really a good way to make money on Mars and sell it back to the Earth or even sell it to somebody else in space. So that will always be a government program. Exquisite science, planetary science, astrophysics, all of that stuff is a government program, it's a government market, and it will and must remain a NASA program. There simply isn't an alternative unless you sort of have philanthropic space, and we're sort of going to wait for the next Jeff Bezos to come out there and decide that he wants to go to Pluto, which, you know, sort of basing your space program on the chance appearance of a philanthropic investor who happens to have the same national interests is, let's just say, risky to say the least. So that'll always be there. I think one of the questions that we're wrestling with now is what's the appropriate role of NASA in the actual, obviously NASA must set the requirements, and then you start getting into the details of what level of requirements, and we're wrestling with that right now. In some programs, I think commercial cargo, CRS. We have come to a really good balance between NASA and industry and is sharing both, if you will, cost and market risk, cost and revenue risk. That seems to work out well. I think we're trying to figure it out a little bit with commercial crew, but this isn't new. We did this with the ELV. And we kind of got it wrong with the ELV. I think we put way too much risk on industry to begin with, and then it ended up swinging to the other end where I think probably government took on way too much risk. So ultimately, when we're talking about NASA and industry, a useful way of thinking about it is how do you balance the risks between the two?
So I want to bring Saeed into this. How do you counsel students when we're talking about this complex? It's not just, I got to go to work for NASA. I mean, we know Suzy Cunningham in the last panel was saying she, took less money to go to work for NASA. Well, today I'll take more money to go to work for, Jeff Bezos. But so how do you count? Maybe he's paying more. I don't know. So how do you counsel?
So it's difficult. One of the things, so more on the science aspect is that we tend to go through the academic route, right? That the way science is done is more academic. You go to grad school, you go to university and do research. And just bringing them aware that there are other opportunities, other skill sets that they have that can be more bridging that science engineering thing is something that I'm really trying to push and kind of broaden my students, that you have those skill sets, you have that critical thinking, and though your degree is not engineering per se, you can contribute to those fields. One thing I kind of want to contribute to that discussion about NASA versus industry versus private sector, one role that I feel that NASA plays quite largely in is also in the international community. And I think that's part of where we're at now. It's actually an international effort. And I feel like NASA definitely has a lead role in a lot of the space exploration that we do now, but as an international effort, and also kind of how they contribute to bringing in these other countries in Europe, and now a lot of India is contributing to space exploration and things like that. I think that's also a critical part of what NASA does too.
Well, and to follow on that, from the education standpoint, what NASA does with outreach and all is for in schools is great, but I don't hear the same, and I may just be wrong and out of tune, but I don't necessarily hear that from the commercial companies. Am I missing something? They do that?
They don't, but they don't have to.
Oh, I know,
I spend more time running the Center for Space Entrepreneurship these days, and I got to tell you that's where the excitement is.
Yeah.
That is where the excitement is. All of my students, which is not a surprise, right? It's a Center for Space Entrepreneurship. All of them want to go to work for commercial companies. And I think, if Elon Musk accomplishes nothing else in the space business, he has made space cool again. I mean, we all love NASA, and NASA has inspirational missions, and we love astronauts, but let's face it, until 2006 or so, space was really at risk of becoming uncool. And space is cool now. And how many people came to watch the Falcon Heavy, which, was a mind-boggling experience to actually watch those two boosters land. Whether it makes economic sense or not is kind of another story. But space is cool, and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have made it cool. But if you look at all of the smaller companies that are dotting, the Space Coast now, there's something happening there that's exciting kids that wasn't there before.
And he flew the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in his car too, didn't he?
I have to disagree just a little bit. I don't think space was ever not cool, to be quite honest. And really, even though shuttle has been retired for 8 years or whatever, and we're not launching people into space from American soil anymore, I travel all over the country. I get invited to obscure places that have nothing to do with space, and young people are absolutely fired up about space. They want to be involved. They all don't want to fly. Some do. But some want to work as engineers, and some want to work as scientists or robotics people. But one thing there's several things I've found over my 60-plus years on the Earth is that things that kids liked when I was little are still cool. We love dinosaurs. When I was growing up, kids still love dinosaurs, and kids love stuff that fly. Space, flying in space. There's a new Top Gun being put together. So I don't think space was ever not cool.
But this is not your father's NASA anymore, right? I mean, this is a whole different NASA than it was when you were flying shuttle.
It is a whole different NASA, and rightly so. We don't want it to be we want NASA to evolve as well. The rest of the country is evolving. But I just kind of think people...
Your point's well taken, and NASA... And I'm overstating my point to make my case. And NASA is doing a better job of incorporating the private sector than most other government agencies. And I give them a lot of credit for getting a lot of it right. But there's a lot of excitement in the commercial side.
And as Suzy pointed out, and we've always used that in the media, we used to always just sit there and say, NASA is the worst on the planet in selling itself. It can't sell itself. And part of the reason was because, as Suzy put, they don't have a budget to sell themselves. We're not putting Coca-Cola on the side of the Saturn V, right? I mean, it's different. They can't do what Elon Musk did.
You're right. They don't. I actually think NASA doesn't need to sell itself. So, first job I had when I went to Boeing was this is 2000, 2001. We were looking at Transhab and commercializing the space station, right? And we did market studies, and we tried to figure out how can you make money on the space station. The best way of making money on the space station was getting your brand affiliated with the NASA brand. Because at that point in time, NASA had absolutely solid brand recognition.
Yeah. I'm not so sure it's about NASA selling itself. It's about selling the idea of space. Yeah. And NASA's only, remember, one member of that space team. I think Suzy talked about it a little bit. Social media has done a tremendous job in keeping space popular. Not so much NASA popular, but space popular, with astronauts texting and tweeting and videos. And I guess the most popular is Chris Hadfield singing his songs and playing guitar from space. Everybody knows Chris Hadfield, or the guy that sings songs and texts and tweets all from space. So,
as the old journalist in me, though, the only complaint I have about all the social media is that it's always all rah-rah for the most part, right? I mean, as the old, let's try to be objective about this. And that's why I say, well, the artificial deadlines. But you don't see any of that out there. And that's fine if you want to be all rah-rah, but there has to be somebody that's sitting out there, who's a gatekeeper, who said, well, wait a minute, guys. Don't try to sell me. Don't this blowing this smoke. Doesn't there have to be some of that?
Yes, and in terms of inspiration, I cannot imagine anything being more inspiring than seeing the first woman and the next man standing on the rim of Shackleton Crater at the lunar South Pole. This thing is extraordinarily topographically dramatic. The Shackleton Crater, for those of you who don't know, which is our next landing site, South Pole, it's 20 kilometers in diameter. It's 4.2 kilometers deep. Okay, so those are just numbers for some of you who may not be able to put meaning to numbers. That's 3 times deeper than the Grand Canyon. Okay, so if you've been to the Grand Canyon and been impressed, imagine being impressed by something that's 3 times deeper. The landscape of the lunar surface is far more dramatic than our best national parks. And I think if we get humans back on that surface, a lot of this is going to go away. People's suspicion of the need for space exploration will just disappear. And we of my generation did get to witness what Al Worden and his colleagues did, and I would very much like to give that same vision of opportunity to another generation of kids. We have let down generations of children in this country, and I think it's up to us to finally bring that around.
Sean?
I'll just say the best thing that we can do, just to add on, for NASA and to advance or the NASA mission or space exploration goals is that actions speak far louder than tweets.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that. As soon as we get on the business of launching SLS and Orion, get on with the Gateway, continuing to leverage our commercial partners, I think that in itself will carry, NASA's mission forward.
Dave mentioned, the next man and the first woman to set foot on the moon. The astronauts of tomorrow, Winston, different breed, are they going to be the same, basic, cut out of the same mold, or are they going to be in shuttle you had all kinds of scientists and, that flew over the years, but is there any difference you think going forward?
Well, I certainly think there'll be some differences. I think every occupation evolves. No matter what, if you look at the sheriffs, law enforcement of the Old West, it probably hinged on big muscles and a fast gun. Mm-hmm. Well, law enforcement today not only has to have a certain amount of muscles and a certain amount of gun, but also some brains. So every occupation evolves, and I think the astronaut corps is going to evolve also. I do think the basic characteristics that make up a good astronaut will remain the same as the basic characteristics that make up a good doctor or a good lawyer or a good teacher. There's certain fundamental character, the parts of character that make up that profession. Al is just not a generation in age, but he's a generation of astronaut before me. We're pretty much the same. I'm not that much different from Alan Shepard and Neil Armstrong, and they're a generation ahead of me, and the generation coming behind me will probably have some of those basic fundamental characteristics. Their training will be a little bit different. The education will be different. And the original 7 were all military test pilots. Mm-hmm. The shuttle era people, the pilots were still military test pilots, but they all had advanced academic degrees. And then you incorporated into that a group of people who were scientists, and that evolution, I think, is going to continue to astronauts in the future.
But building on, and we always talk about, standing on the shoulders of giants. It's the same way with the astronauts going forward, right? I mean, they're going to be a lot more prepared. They're going to be, with no disrespect to the other astronauts, probably a lot smarter, because of the education, the level of education they have, prepared, more and so they're going to be different, perhaps, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but in that regard.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what I was trying to say. The 2 young men that received their scholarships today are smarter, and you have to be careful how you use that word, smarter, at this point than I was at that same age. They know more about aerospace and engineering at their age of 21 and 22, whatever, than I did at 21 and 22. So that respect is going to change. But the fundamental characteristics that's going to make up a good astronaut are not going to change. The old thing about being goal-oriented, focused, type A personality, no guts, no glory, that's not going to change. Mm-hmm. When you strap your hiney to all those millions of pounds of rocket, the same characteristics that allow you to do that years ago when Al did are going to be the same ones that will do it 50 years, 100 years from now.
Well, when you're strapped,
that's not for everybody.
When you're strapping your hiney in there, you're relying on a whole bunch of other really smart people that have gotten it right on the other end.
Of course you are. But those people, their goal, their characteristics, their training is to do their end, and there are a group of people whose characteristics do the other end. And my point is the certain fundamental character, whatever the word is, that allow you to be good at what it is you do. Yeah. There are people who operate emergency rooms. They've got certain characteristics that allow them to do what they do and do it well. People who are attorneys, people who are university presidents. There's certain characteristics that make up a good university president that I think will carry on from generation to generation.
Dave, did you want to add something?
Just that I've had the distinct honor and good pleasure of training the last 3 classes of astronauts to work in lunar-like terrains, and Winston's exactly right. They are a special breed of people. You know it when you're teaching astronauts. They're the best students that you will ever get. They are very observant. They take in data. They process that data. They make decisions that are almost inevitably right. It is just extraordinary to watch them function. Yeah, at least over the last 3 classes, the technique, the aptitude, the personalities can vary, but the skill set that's kind of behind all of that is the same.
You know, in the first, I wanted to get your opinions on this and bring this back up. In the first session, we talked about that Boeing test and only 2 of the 3 parachutes deployed. And then it kind of struck with me something we talked about, the institutional knowledge, and that's a lot of it's lacking now. The old guys and women are all retired and gone on. And my question to them before we got on up here was, well, you know, how come they got it right in Apollo and the parachutes all worked? How come 50 years later we can't get parachutes to work? I mean, see, this is something that in my small mind, not one of those big astronaut brains, but in my small mind, I can't get my head around. Does anybody want to?
So I guess I need to field that one. There's a lot to be said about parachutes. And, you know, I will tell you as we get closer to launching people on our commercial provider spacecraft, and we're in the middle of qualifying those parachute systems as we speak right now. We learn something new on every test. And, you know, without going into specific details, you know, materials are different. The spacecraft are slightly different. We're learning something every single time we do one of those tests. And so it's a good question. And I can tell you that the test that we just completed with the pad abort test is going to tell us something. And right now, we're still looking at the data, but there's nothing standing between us and launching that first orbital flight demonstration test with the Boeing Starliner spacecraft in December. So
that's that first. Then the human flights come
this is
first of the year, after the first of the year.
Yep, that's right.
Right.
So, but do we really, it's a normal human thing to forget the failures and, you know, remember the high points. So there were failures during Gemini, Mercury, Apollo, and we tend to forget them. So I don't know that your statement there that everything seemed to work perfectly is actually
Did I say that? I just said the parachutes worked. But that's my small brain, remember.
Yeah. So, no, so things are going to fail, and we just need to press forward. And I kind of like to press forward to 2024 as fast as we can.
So part of this is kind of an artifact of the way we're running these programs. We're running these programs as fixed price programs. And in Apollo and throughout the entire program, and probably most of what we've done in human spaceflight has been relatively unconstrained in terms of the amount of testing we would do to ensure that astronauts are safe. I think with some programs, and Commercial Crew may be an example of it, contractors have fixed price contracts. And if they are going to exceed the scope of what they've already bid in their contract, they're losing money. So there's that tension. And this is something we have to figure out. And it's something we're going to have to get right, and it doesn't seem like it's that far off, aside from the fact that we're 2 years late, and 2 years extending a program means 2 years of additional cost, and that's kind of problematic. But, you know, this is in some ways a natural, I think, readjustment of how we're going to need to do business in the future. And it's not necessarily that we will not put astronauts at risk, right? We will not be comfortable flying astronauts in CST or in Dragon until Safety and Mission Insurance is completely comfortable with that. And that's just something we're going to have to get used to.
Saeed, I want to go back, Saeed, real quick on this. Just this, we're talking about, because we haven't really addressed this, research and science that's been done on the space station and will be done in the future, whether it's on the surface of, of the moon or on the orbiting gate, wherever it's taking place. Where do we stand right now? I mean, there was so much promise about the wonderful discoveries that were going to emerge from space station and science on the space station, because you're doing it in zero gravity. And yes, a lot of wonderful things have come out of that. But perhaps far less. We're going to cure cancer in space. There were a lot of really highbrow promises that were made that have not come to fruition, and likely will never come to fruition on the ISS. So, so where do we stand with research going forward?
Do you want to go first, or?
Don't look at me like
all right,
that.
So I'll jump right in. So this is one of my favorite topics. I can't really speak about ISS, but the moon I'm very familiar with. And the samples that the astronauts collected were huge. And when you listen to Discovery or Nova type shows about the moon, oftentimes the big highlights of those shows come from the Apollo samples, the samples that were collected. And I'll just rattle off a few, like the origin of the Earth-Moon system. I mean, we went to the moon, but we learned more about our own planet's origins. Very, very important. We learned that the moon and the Earth was once surrounded by a magma ocean. We understand that the Earth and the moon was severely bombarded by asteroids and comets 4.5 billion years ago. There's an idea that maybe that bombardment has something to do with the origin and early evolution of life on our planet. I mean, these are all big ideas that came out of the science that the Apollo astronauts provided us. And those same types of issues can be explored in the future if we get back to the lunar surface. I mean, in some sense, science has been stalled for 50 years. And in the same sense that Apollo catalyzed American science, I'm hoping Artemis will catalyze American science once again. Not only just the technology that was addressed by the first panel, but the science. I think it will be huge. It's incalculable is the way I look at it.
We've just got about 3 or 4 minutes left. If everybody has, and we could go for another hour, but everybody has some final thoughts.
Sure. So one thing we haven't talked about that I think is really critical to what's happening today is sustainability, right? And we talk about how we're able to sustain this program beyond administration, beyond programs. And if you look back at things, one of the ways programs become more sustainable, I think, is by having a broader, more durable political coalition behind them. We've seen this with the space station, with the international partners. I think one of the aspects that we are looking at with respect to Artemis that makes me feel more optimistic is the potential of bringing the market in as a constituent. There is no more powerful constituency in the world than the global marketplace, right? If companies are making money on the moon, probably not Mars, we will go there, and we will go there to stay. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to be thinking about as we're developing programs today. Right now, we are talking about it, but actions matter.
So what I want to talk about is kind of responding to your last question is, okay, so we did set out to try to answer some really important questions that probably we won't be able to answer with the technology we have, but the science that has come out of it, we have gotten so much science that we didn't know we would get out of it. For example, the fact that, for most of us, we grew up, Pluto was a planet. And now we decided Pluto is not a planet because now we discovered there's so many things out in our own solar system we didn't know existed before. We thought they might be there, but we didn't know how many, how much. The fact that we've discovered exoplanets. Again, this is completely not something that was planned for. And so I think there's a lot of stuff that has come out of science that we didn't necessarily set out to do, but we were able to discover.
Pluto will always be a planet in my heart. I'm sorry. For all of you Pluto deniers out there.
I agree.
I want to speak just briefly about, as a representative of LPI, as part of the University Space Research Association, and make 2 points. One, we need to train a workforce to do Artemis and probe deeper into the solar system. And so that is going to take our partner universities, Florida Tech, and the students that are in those universities, and hopefully we can do take some actions that make the interface between these institutions, NASA, and the commercial industry work better. That also requires a program, though, that's going to inspire the children and the students who are going through those programs. And so I really, really hope that we press forward with this lunar exploration program so that we have something that the students can see in front of them that's achievable and something that can grow.
Yeah, let me go back to your question about ISS. While we may not have had the cure of the cancer kind of discoveries on ISS, I can tell you that the body of knowledge that we have acquired over the last 20 years, having a permanently crewed station, is enabling us so that we know that we're going to be able to live and learn, live and work on the moon for long periods of time and eventually go to Mars. I mean, we're growing our own food for the first time in space. And it's hard to grow food in microgravity. And we didn't really know how to do it when we started, and we are incrementally improving that one step at a time. So everything that we're doing on ISS eventually contributes to the future expansion of the human species beyond low Earth orbit, okay? And as far as final thoughts for this, it's great to be part of our nation's space program right now. I grew up in upstate New York, and there was only one thing I ever wanted to do, was to work at NASA at the Kennedy Space Center and launch big rockets and go back to the moon. And I grew up watching the Apollo missions, and we're about to do it again. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this magnificent NASA and our industry partner team.
Wrap it up, Winston.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. My final thought would be, as we branch out into space and we live longer and go further, the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is going to be the challenge having to do with people. We can build new engines, we can figure out how to navigate and how to propel and all that stuff, but we do a pretty poor job of improving people. In fact, we appear to be going in the opposite direction from what we ought to be doing. I would like to encourage our young people to be open-minded, seek out people who are different from you, and get to know them. Because everything you do in space has to do with teamwork. I'm not talking about the teamwork on the ground, I'm talking about teamwork up there. When you send people off to Mars, which is a 3-year proposition with 4 or 5 of you in the shuttle, the capsule together, you're going to have to learn how to get along with each other, and we do a pretty poor job of getting along with each other here on Earth right now. So what we as university administrators and professors have got to do a better job is open and the minds of our young people to learn to work and live together with each other. To break down those barriers and work as a team, because if you don't have that teamwork up there, your mission will not succeed. And like Al said, when the embers burn out 4.5 billion years from now and this planet is gone, if we have not learned to work together as a team, the human species will not survive.
Thank you to our panel. It was terrific. I really do wish we had more time. Pleasure. Fun. Yeah. Absolutely. A lot of fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. A lot of fun. Thank you, my dear. Thanks, Winston.
Appreciate it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap up our panel discussions with the future. And let me bring up our panelists. Alyssa Carson, who is an astrobiology student at Florida Tech. Alyssa, where are you? Come on up. Alyssa. Thank you. Wow, what is that? What does that say? Command module, what is that? Look, do you see this dress she's got on? Command module main control panel. And what? Look at that. Huh? All I brought were my Apollo socks. Scott Henderson, Vice President, Test and Flight Operations, Florida Site Director for Blue Origin. Scott? Jeffrey Isaacson, President and CEO of USRA. T. Dwayne McKay, President of Florida Tech. And Cynthia Simmons, Deputy Director of Planning and Business Management Operations at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. So you folks get to bring us home today, okay? And then we can go have lunch. So I have to start with you. So I understand, Alyssa, that you want to be the first person, one of the first, right? My microphone's, oh, there it is, to walk on Mars. Really?
Well, I mean, ever since I was little, it's always been a big dream of mine to, well, obviously when I was young, I got interested in space and Mars kind of in general. And as I've grown up, I've wanted to learn more about space and about Mars and kind of the trajectory of how to actually contribute to the space program and how to encourage further space exploration.
So what's your goal? What do you want to do? Do you want to be the first person on Mars, or would you settle for second person? I don't know.
Well, I feel like as far as like all the missions to space, I'm definitely doing my best and studying as much as I can to get to that position, and then eventually applying and seeing what happens, and seeing where they put me. I can't really tell them to make me the first. So.
Well, what are you looking to do? Where are you looking to go? Because we talked in the last panel a lot about commercial space versus NASA. You're right there in it. I mean, what are you thinking as to what direction? I mean, do you want to go to work for Scott's company, or, well, it's not your company, but we'll take it. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, currently at Florida Tech, I'm studying astrobiology, and then looking about applying that to a lot of the science that's happening right now, especially talking about other worlds and going back to the moon, going to Mars, and so forth, and then studying, soil samples, the atmosphere, the history, the kind of future of what Mars can look like for humans as a whole, and kind of the future plans of Mars. So being able to study those things and seeing how they can actually benefit us, and what benefits we can bring back from Mars or apply to Mars, and overall how we kind of push kind of that further space exploration of learning more about Mars and seeing what we can actually work with, and then continuing to develop that into the future.
So have you thought about do you have a preference whether you go to work for, say, NASA or a private company at this point? I mean, that was kind of what we were...
Yeah, I mean, I guess whoever's ready first, I guess.
Whoever's ready first, right? Good. So here's a question that now, if President Kennedy were here today and he were to lay out a grand vision. Now we really can't use the moon because he already did that, right? But so what would his grand vision be today? Just open it up to all of you. What do you think Kennedy's grand vision would be? Where would we be going? What would we be doing? Anybody want to take it first?
Well, there's a lot of things that we could be doing, and where places we could be going. We've talked about Mars, certainly, in exploration. But, we as a society and a world have other challenges. If you look at our atmosphere today, and, it is full of gigatons of carbon dioxide. We have a grand challenge there of, trying to combat the changes that's causing to our planet. Planet's gone through that before us. We have some data on that. 3 million years ago, we had the same types of concentrations, we believe, in our atmosphere. And, back then, we believe the temperatures were, 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher, and seawater 15 to 25 meters. So how do we get the carbon out? That's a big thing. We can talk about cancer research. I mean, most of our cancer treatments, tend to try to attack cancer cells, but the problem is they attack regular cells. And that's why those treatments, tend not always work as well. Lots of advancements there that, could be another moonshot of the future.
I think at Blue Origin anyway, we don't claim to be able to predict the future, but we do run scenarios. So I'll give you one scenario that maybe could play out, right? So lots of people thinking about putting a few people a long way. Maybe a different scenario is how do we take those things that are important as the stepping stone from Earth to space, right? And I use an analogy that Jeff Bezos, our founder, talks about when he started Amazon.com, right? So he didn't have to build infrastructure. The post office was there. The internet was there. You could reach out to customers. In space, you don't have the infrastructure to either build an enduring presence around our planet or to push an enduring presence to the future, right? So one scenario is how do we build the infrastructure to get the building blocks to space from which then you can jump off. So I think maybe that's a vision that we might be able to see in our lifetimes that might be one scenario you'd think about.
Well, you know, the sun's certainly eventually going to expire, and that'll be a problem. But we have a lot bigger problem already. And I was a Kennedy fan, and what I would expect he might look at this point in time is our planet is in deep trouble. Whether it be the carbon, there's a variety of things, and it's somewhat cyclic. But you know, if I were to guess, what JFK would say is, hey, we need to devote every resource we have to ensure that the health of this planet is around so that when the sun expires, it'll still be here. Because it's the greatest spaceship ever built, still, this Earth that we're flying on. And I think that would be a grand goal that anyone would be proud to set, and I think you could get a lot of enthusiasm for it. Cynthia?
Well, when I was younger, so for Al, I was 10 years old when you landed on the moon, and I was enthralled. But at that time, I thought we'd be flying like the Jetsons right now in spaceships and stuff like that already. So I think if Kennedy were now, I would go with stuff like that. How can we have sustainability up there, the infrastructure we need to be able to have sustainability for not just looking way out when the sun is gone, but also in between, curiosity of man and looking at and learning things has really accelerated because we went to the moon. Who we are, where we are, all those things like that. And that curiosity in the circles where this is our life, our career, yes, it's exciting. When I go talk to those who don't circle in that, they have no idea. Like when they landed on the moon, I had no idea there was a NASA. No one in my sphere knew anything about that. I just knew the United States went there, and whatever they're doing, I want to do, but no one could tell me how, what, who, anything like that. And there are large segments of our society that are still in that space like that. So if we could ignite that by sustainability, you couldn't ignore that with social media and entertainment and everything if we're up in space. So.
We're talking about the future here, and I know I interviewed Franklin Chang Diaz, space shuttle astronaut, flew more times than anybody ever, right? Or as many as any of the others. And Franklin always would say to me in the interviews, eventually his belief is that in the future the Earth will become like our national park, and that we'll come back and visit the Earth. It won't be a place that we live on anymore and ruin and spoil. It'll be a place that we can come back to visit, and we'll be living, perhaps as your founder believes, on these enormous colonies in space, not on other planets, but colonies that can hold 1 million people and are miles long, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, this idea that, Earth is zoned residential, right? And space is zoned industrial. So you take those, it's this whole idea of space to save the Earth. How can we push those things that are damaging the Earth today up, right? But it all goes back to, these are awesome visions, but we got to do something today, right? So what can we do today? We got to make space affordable. It's $10,000 a pound to put something into space. That's not going to get us there. We got to get down to $100 a pound, right? So how are we going to do it? I mean, there's some neat things out there. Reusability, I think, is a big deal. There's people pursuing that. I think we've got to get more people involved. It can't be a couple of governments and a few billionaires going after this. You've got to get all the ideas on the table. So this is where the young generation comes in. We need thousands of people and companies and teams thinking about this, not a few, enterprises.
Talking about and we talked about it in the second panel here about, commercialization of space and whether it makes NASA, less of a player, the middleman. What do you see? I mean, do you see, because you guys are doing your own thing, Bezos, your guys, and Musk is doing his own thing, and Branson's doing his own thing, and everybody's doing their own thing, and NASA's doing its own thing. I mean, where are we going here?
My opinion is I think that's the start, right? I mean, look at Silicon Valley, right? The reason that's so successful is, one, there's money to be made, but two, there's a lot of people doing it. I mean, and best ideas bubble to the top. Lots of failure, but good ideas rise to the top. You got to get more players in the game to make this successful.
Yeah, sometimes innovations occur when people do their own thing. So I don't think that we should be so concerned that there might be different commercial entities that seem to be, working in different directions. 20 years ago, I mean, there were basically, two launch providers, and they kind of unified to one. And now we have, a number of them. And, we've actually seen prices have come down, maybe not as much as we need to for long-term travel, but to get to LEO, it's cheaper than it was 20 years ago. We've got all sorts of new innovations. I mean, reusable launch vehicles. I mean, how come it took so long to figure out that pendulum stability can be utilized to actually, reuse and land a launcher? I don't worry too much about that. I really don't. I think that the natural forces of the market will actually lead to more innovations and spur advancement.
And will we do the kind of because the criticism, of course, to some degree of the commercial companies is they're not going to go anywhere or do anything unless there's money to be made. Ultimately, if we can find a reason to go to Mars to mine it, or we can find a reason to go to the moon to mine it, then commercial companies will do it. It's altruism may sound good, but in reality, they got to make money flying. Are we going to lose sight of the idea of exploration and science and research down the road? I mean, is that going to be impacted by the fact that if you can't make money on it, you're not going to do it?
Well, excuse me, but I don't think so. I mean, the university, that's where the universities play such a huge role. And we're able to do great research because we have cheap manpower. They're called students. And and you don't have any that work that cheap, you really don't. So the fundamental need for continuing is just great ideas, and it's amazing. And just to speak to our students, they accomplish things that those of us that have been around a while already know you can't do. And since they don't know any better, they go do it. And so I don't think a single year goes by that we're not shocked at some of the results that we get out of our senior design, et cetera. Them doing things that they should have known better, and they shouldn't have tried, but they didn't know better, so they accomplished it. So I think the great ideas are going to generate the great accomplishments. And if you said we really haven't accomplished some of the things we were after in terms of cancers, we will. I mean, I don't have any doubt whatsoever. And will it be the low gravity environment that helps us do that? Absolutely. And so, people that want to make money and that are clever and that listen to others, they come up with things that can make money. If you were to develop a drug that actually destroyed cancer without destroying the other cells in the body, do you think you'd make money on that? I would hope so. I mean, if you can make as much as they did off Gatorade, surely you could make that much money off of that. So, and I think the young people that we see every year are brighter and brighter because they're, in this area in particular where we live, because bright parents have bright children, and they're getting brighter every year. They're getting better every year. And their ideas are getting better every year. And they're not held back by knowing things that are not knowing things. So I'm really encouraged about the future.
Cynthia, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's a natural tug and pull, though, between profitability and doing science. And And it's sometimes, we even see it now, but Goddard is a science center.
Yeah.
So human exploration is not really been the mission, and that's been a challenge. That's how we shift towards Artemis, and that's the conversation we're having. What science have we done that will apply to that? So I think, though, as the profitability pushes going into space, that's miniaturization, making things cheaper, modularization, things like that, in order for human to be in space, science will have to be there in order to make that happen. And that will open up other things and discoveries that they'll see along the way. So I think those two go together.
Let me ask this probably to you and I guess Scott. The talent pool that's out there now of young people, are you encouraged by it? Is it really something that people like Alyssa here, are you seeing that more and more interest in exploration and what you guys are doing and what NASA is doing now? I mean, is there a change? You see some sort of a shift?
I do actually see a shift. And I see a return. So I think it's what Winston said, that an interest in NASA, maybe not so much. They know NASA, but my exposure to students today is there's this thing out there, but maybe it's their grandparents thing, not even their parents, okay? Grandparents thing, but space though, and the commercialization, SpaceX and those have made it exciting and maybe don't understand. I was really blown away by the kids yesterday. There's no way that I had that kind of thing at their age. I was still playing with, he said dominoes, I was a tomboy. So I was playing with, dinosaurs, playing with that stuff with my male cousins, not thinking about space stuff. But one of the challenges though we have is with, and I'm going to say this, the entertainment world, social media. We've got a pull in our society towards that, and a lot, even my youngest son is 30, and I didn't start when I was 2, so just so y'all know. He said to me, it's interesting what you do, but I think you're a lot more interested in it than I am. And he's really bright, but he decided to go into the entertainment world. So, and he's not alone. And also the challenge at school, we were talking about this yesterday, Saida and I were talking about the kids making decisions on what academic degrees are going to go on based on what their friends are doing on the off hours outside of class. And so that's a challenge we have in being able to excite that group at the elementary school will make a difference, I think. She's nodding her head. Will make a difference in what we get at the college level. I don't know.
I'll let you go after I do, but John, what I see is we collect a lot of data, right? I mean, if nothing else, we're data-driven. And the thing that brings people to Blue Origin, because we're competing against, folks in Seattle, folks here, NASA, a software company. What we find is the thing that brings young people to Blue Origin is our vision. Millions of people living and working in space. It's not building Walmarts, it's millions of people living and working in space. That's one. Two, when I look at what we're doing today, how we're building this next generation rocket, the breakthroughs are coming not from, because we have people from every rocket engine and rocket booster that's been developed in the last 4 decades. We have people from those teams. They're helping, but the breakthroughs are coming from the young generation. It's the people, as we talked about, that aren't sort of unencumbered by what they don't know. Clearly, there's lots more tools available today than us old folks know about, but they bring an attitude that is quite different. So I think there has been a real shift. You can really feel the momentum.
So it's like what President McKay was saying. They don't know that they're not supposed to be able to do that, so they do it, right? And they succeed and do it. Absolutely. Alyssa, you were going to say?
Yeah, definitely. I think along with the shift of kind of this next generation, kind of regaining just a huge spark of interest in space and in science in general. I think that there's been kind of a shift along with the social media and just seeing more things pop up about space or space being trendy or coming up. You see teenagers and they're wearing NASA shirts. Do they know what it stands for? Maybe, maybe not, but they're representing it nonetheless. And you kind of see that come along, and even something simple like that, maybe it causes someone to go look it up, and so that kind of pulls and continues and works towards having even more kids gaining that interest or maybe looking into it. And it's pretty neat to kind of see that happening right now, and in terms of TV shows and movies, space is kind of everywhere right now. And being able to see a bunch of this next generation being exposed to that and then that getting them interested, I think is where we're going to see a lot more kids wanting to pursue space, and even coming to a place like here at Florida Tech, and me going from a place where, you know, people were like, yeah, space is all right, and then coming here like, space is so cool. It's so incredible to be surrounded by so many people that share that interest, and I think as we all continue our interest in space and develop it, kind of all the space nerds kind of getting together, you know, and working towards bigger and better things.
Don't you worry about in the future and going forward, particularly from what you see and picking up on what you said, we talk about social media and you talk about all the video games that the kids are playing today, and you know, I mean, my oldest son has a PhD in nuclear chemistry from Texas A&M, and he got, you know, scarfed right up by Intel, so he's out in Portland, but he loves those video games. And I mean, you know, it's just part of the culture, though, right? I mean, it's part of the generation. Maybe you can address that, right? I mean, is it?
I mean, I definitely feel, I mean, especially...
You never play those games, I know.
Whatever, like
She didn't answer.
She builds them.
Whatever your interest is, obviously, it can be something incredibly complicated, and what you're working towards or what, like, your dream might be. But, I mean, I feel like it is part of the generation, but I feel like there's also more of a balance in balancing kind of what you're working towards, and then, like, separating that from hobbies or seeing how your hobby can apply to what you're doing, and kind of a mix of both of them.
But it's like the men and women who are flying drones from, right? I mean, how come they can do it so well? Because they played video games growing up, right? I mean, there's something to that.
There is, and right now what we're trying to do is shift, because you have the 50-plus-year-olds who believe we're being creative, and we are, but the breakthroughs that you get, the reason the Apollo was, well, I'll say this, the reason the Apollo was so great is we didn't know we couldn't do it. Right. Even though we were older. And the thing we have that we've untapped, we need to untap it, is in the younger generation. They don't know we can't do it. So let them get involved so that we can see what we can do, because they don't know we can't do it.
You know, gaming was kind of a nightmare for my contemporaries as parents. And, I would say that a lot of that nightmare ends when your son or daughter grows up and gets a job in the gaming industry. Writing software, virtual reality, and pushing the bounds of information technology. There's a lot of good that comes out of that.
Yeah. We talked a lot about risk and the aversion to risk. And Scott, do you think that there's more pressure on you guys today, and there's more restrictions on what you can do, or more fail-safes built in? I don't know. How would you feel about that, when it comes to flying humans?
Yeah, kind of go back to, maybe it was Andy in the earlier panel that was talking about it. There's a different risk posture, the government side and the commercial side, right? So, I think the commercial industry in general, I've worked for a few of them, is willing to take more risk, because the benefit is there when you take it. I mean, I think you have people in it for the long haul here too. This isn't a 1 or 2 or 3 year return on investment, right? So you're going to have to take some risks to get there. I think what I've seen is we are more prone to take risks. However, for big things like going to the moon, I mean, we also realize we just announced a national team with big players, right? And that, you got to balance it, right? I mean, you have to know when to take it and when not. I think generally we're forward leaning. I think the government side is going to be a little bit, more risk averse, and you got to find that sweet spot.
I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I think I worry more about how we're managing risk. right? I mean, there's always risk, there always was risk, and, whether we're actually managing it properly. And, as we think long term, I think that there's probably, a lot more to harvest there in terms of, how we manage it. I mean, somebody in the audience, can help me. I think that the management reserve on the Apollo program was something like 100%. I mean, when have you last seen a major government-funded development program with 100% MR?
No.
And it gets spent, and you burn down risk. So, I think when you try to do audacious things, you need to actually, recognize that there's always going to be big risks involved and figure out a way to manage them.
Going forward, there's a lot. We're talking about colonizing the moon, putting, certainly research colonies there before we go to Mars, and then colonizing Mars, although I know your founder's not a big fan of colonizing Mars. But how far off in the future? I mean, we're talking, decades. The old saying about Mars, Mars is 25 years ago, Mars was 25 years away. It's still 25 years away. Nothing's changed.
I'm not so sure, but I don't have a crystal ball. But if you go back and look at, in fact, we were talking about this Apollo time and what we didn't have technologically in the society at the start of that. We are light years away from as far as the ground floor of what's technologically normal part of our everyday life. And I think if the difference is, though, if we could focus all of our resources and our vision on that, we could probably condense the time instead of it being some undetermined amount of time. So I think we could actually get there faster than we think, maybe not 2024. Does that mean we gotta go?
That's an Amber Alert.
Oh, okay. So maybe not 2024, but if we focus, that's what Apollo did. Everything was focused on that, but our ground floor of technological every day with the average is so much higher. So I think we actually could shorten that.
I think you got to make it more routine, though. Today, I probably have my number off a little bit, but about 550 people have been to space above the Kármán line, right? That's too small a population if you're going to take on something like going to Mars. We've got to make it more routine, right? So that means get it affordable. That means do it a lot. That means get really good at it. And that's where we're headed, right? But you got to start with a small step to take that big step. But until it becomes routine, I think you can do one-offs, but you're not really going to take that big next step.
Well, you're absolutely right. But the one thing, there's still some serious technical issues that haven't been addressed. I mean, they're being addressed, but they're not there yet. I mean, the radiation issue being a gigantic one. So, could we send someone to Mars and get them back? Probably. Sure. Would they want to still be living at this point in time? They might not be appreciative of the condition they're in, but those will get solved. I mean, I don't have any doubt they'll be solved. And so, I don't know if it's 10 years or 20 years, but it's certainly not next year. But we've got to solve those problems before, and the research is being done in research labs and universities, et cetera.
Are the technical issues for, say, going to deep space, or even going back to live and work on the moon, are the technical issues the most profound that we have to deal with, or is it the psychological issues of long periods of travel, long periods of isolation from the human? And I know we've had astronauts, Kelly was there for a year, but that's still not the same thing. He's still, right? I mean, it's different. Is that maybe the most significant thing we'll have to deal with, or is it the technical?
I'm not an astronaut. I wanted to be all my life. But I think, actually, I don't know if you could say one or the other is higher. You have the human aspect of it, you have the physiological and the psychological part of it. If we know, even today on Earth, compacting a lot of people in a small space is non-trivial. It's very problematic over long periods of time, and we still have sun and all of that. So up there, without that consistent sun, that's part of our psyche and physiological health. I think that's non-trivial. At the same time, we do have some technological challenges of sustainability up there that are non-trivial. So I don't know that you could say one or the other. It's higher.
Both. Yeah. Both. I mean, you've got to solve both sets of problems, and we're not going to know how bad the psychological problem is until we're experiencing it, unfortunately.
Well, and that's not a real good formula either, to send 4 people, off on a long deep space mission and say, well, we'll see how they do, when they come back. So, I mean, Scott, you were going to say something?
No. I'll leave it to the experts on that.
Well, I'm no expert, but there are other physiological challenges too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, our bodies are designed here in a 1G environment. We have a pump that moves fluids through our circulatory system that is countering those effects. When you get into a lower G environment, fluids change in your body. You get pressure buildup, you can lose visual acuity, you have bone density loss, the radiation issues. But, it's really easy to come up with reasons why you can't do these things. And if you look back into the early 60s and the enormity of the uncertainties associated with how we're going to get to the moon by the end of the decade, I think that, that pales in comparison to what's ahead of us today. I really do. These are technical challenges that with a concerted effort, vision, national unity, and money to go after it, and to actually burn down those risks, we can solve those problems.
I was just thinking from the standpoint that we're awfully smart. We can solve the technical stuff, but the body has limitations, no matter how I mean, we've even found out on the shuttle flights that male astronauts had a susceptibility to issues with their eyesight that women didn't, women astronauts. And we don't understand that yet. So I mean, there's lots of things physiologically and psychologically that maybe we push the body to a certain limit. And you know what, folks, that's about what we can, that was the point I was saying, that we're smart enough to solve the technical stuff, but can we do that with the human body?
Don't know, because now you're getting into a situation too, is how adaptable can the human body be from an evolutionary standpoint into the future. I don't think one lifetime is enough to answer that question. Actually, one answer.
It sure would be neat to invent something that was more efficient than chemical propulsion.
Yeah,
cut the time down on that trip.
Hey, as an old propulsion guy, I resent that. But actually, when I worked for NASA, my boss, who was pretty high-ranking fellow, asked me to invent warp drive. And seriously.
I believe you.
And so after working on it 2 or 3 weeks, I decided someone much smarter than me was going to have to do that. But, I mean, there are some solutions out there. And it's mathematically not impossible. It's physically probably impossible, at least for now. But there is going to be a huge breakthrough at some point in time. And, I doubt it'll be, well, it might be warp drive, I don't know. But I love Star Trek, so that would make me very happy. But it's, there's going to be, there's a breakthrough waiting to happen. We certainly get high ISPs now. We can do things for long missions that we couldn't do before.
And you mentioned, and I mentioned Franklin Chang Diaz, and he has his laboratory out in Houston, and he's working on his Bessemer engine and its plasma, et cetera, et cetera. And that's great. But why? But his criticism always was, but nobody really takes this stuff seriously enough to spend enough money to develop that next generation engine. I mean, you could have flown with nuclear power, but forget that. We're not flying. I mean, RTGs are bad enough. We're not flying nuclear-powered spacecraft, but you could get the kinds of velocities you need to make trips simpler and faster and not put the stresses on the body. But in Franklin's point is, we wasted, his feeling is, with shuttle, he would say this to you, we wasted 30 years. And we have not pushed new technologies beyond the chemical engines. And everybody else, you guys are still all doing that, chemical engines.
That's where I think commercialization will help us out a little bit, because that push for profitability, that oftentimes is the drive for the breakthroughs of innovation, technological innovation. So.
And there are things we could do right now, but it's just a lot more money than anyone's willing to invest. And private investors, even a Bezos, don't have the funds. We could put up a rotating or an orbiting laser system that's solar pumped, and you could transmit laser energy to vehicles all over the galaxy, and it's doable, but it would cost, we're not talking millions, we're talking maybe trillions of dollars. And so no one's going to make that kind of commitment for a while. So there are technologies we know about that we could actually develop, but I don't know who's going to spend the money to do that. It's the American, it's the country's budget to do something like that. Not 4%, but 40% or maybe more than that.
We have a pervasive fear of the word nuclear.
Yeah.
And, it's not helping. It's really not. I mean, there are designs on the shelf. There is money that's being, budgeted for that now. So, the current NASA team is actually working to, try to move forward nuclear thermal propulsion. But, needless to say, there are an awful lot of political considerations in trying to move that technology forward. And I really think it's very difficult to expect commercial enterprise to enter that arena and succeed, given, the tendency of government to overregulate.
But we're spending, I don't know how much it is on SLS, chemical rocket. And every time we launch SLS, it's going to be a minimum of $2 billion, right? And I know you guys, the exploration upper stage issue that just, NASA's going to stick with Boeing, and they didn't even, with your proposal. But the amount of money we're talking about, but it's another chemical rocket. We're not pushing the generational envelope, are we? I mean, I know you're saying, yeah, a little bit, but it's what it is. It's a little bit. But is it significant enough?
Well, at the risk of maybe losing my job saying this.
Then don't answer that.
No, what is really, Al talked about it, we're missing that cohesive, coherent vision as to why we're doing this. And so, we're spending a lot of money, but I think if we had a why, are we going a certain direction, maybe we could focus those dollars and make those breakthroughs. That's my opinion.
Isn't that the difficulty, though, that, the why is always the toughest part when you're trying to sell something to the American public? Well, why are we going back to the moon? We've already been there. We did that. Why do we need to do that? The hardest part is the why, right? And it's like, well, why do we need space? Well, because it's there. Because we're explorers by nature. And there's all that wonderful sort of flowing, right?
Well, yeah, and one of the things we haven't done a really good job as a society is connecting our space exploration, what that has benefited society, everybody's everyday life. If we could make that connection better, maybe they can see some reason.
There's a huge difference in setting goals and having a vision. Yeah. And that, I think that's where we're short. I mean, we have some great goals, and both the commercial companies and NASA, but there's nobody's really stated clearly a real vision of what we're going to do with all these things. And it goes back to, justifying what we've done before. But, if that visionary person or the vision statement could really be made, I think a whole host of new people and some of us older people could get behind it.
Well, does the equation change? Does the vision become clearer when you mentioned it, Scott, we have only flown 540 some people in space, in the totality of every flight that's ever flown from any nation. And when you start flying on New Shepard, or when Branson starts flying, does it change as more and more people get to experience that? I mean, clearly that's still going to be an infinitesimally small amount of people that have, but it broadens the base.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Al and Winston probably speak to this, right? But I mean, from all astronauts I've talked to, that view of, the thin blue line and blue marble changes how you think about things. So the more people you can get there, the more momentum I think you get. I mean, New Shepard's an interesting concept because it's reasonably affordable, will be. It's a short mission. You're up and down in a few hours, right? You get, you're at the Kármán line, so you're not orbiting the Earth. You're up at the limb of the Earth, looking at the thin blue line. But the idea that you can fly something that's that simple in a relative sense, right? That frequently, once a week or maybe every other day, when you get to it, you're going to grow that number, right? And part of that is that as you grow that number, you gain momentum. It's this flywheel effect, right? And you get people thinking differently. So that's at least one reason that, similar to how barnstormers in the early days of flying everybody was like, I'm not getting in that machine, right? Barnstormers would go town to town and actually for $1 or something, take somebody up and change the way of thinking so that today we get on an airliner, don't even think twice about it, right? I mean, it's just like getting on the bus or going to work. If we can get more people to wrap their heads around something that today is very complex and somewhat scary and make that more routine, I think that goes a long way.
You're nodding your head. I mean, are we going to change the, I mean, so they're space tourists, though. They're not astronauts, are they? I mean, it's...
The definition of an astronaut...
I know. What's the definition of an astronaut?
Yeah, right.
What's the definition?
Well, it's
We could always lower the line, too, down to 80 kilometers or something. Make it a lot easier.
Well, if you look at terrestrial analogies, when things became the tourist destination, that's when they became popular. A lot more people got on a lot of radar. So there is whether you call it astronaut or not, the space tourism, though, will be a vehicle, a mechanism to help bring this into everyday life of the thinking of the average citizen.
So,
Scott, are you ready to tell us something? Hello?
I'm not going to tell
you. You're going to tell me how much the flight cost? I know. But back to that question about colonizing these other worlds. And is it still, how realistic is that? And what are we looking at as a time frame? Can you put a crystal ball on and say, this is where we're going to be in 50 years? Because like I said, Mars has been 25 years away for 25 years. So do we put a crystal ball on and say, 50 years from now, we're going to be here. We're going to be doing this? No?
Well, I tend to be you probably tell from I tend to be the more optimistic, visionary type person. But if you don't have a target like that, it's really hard to make anything of that happen. So if you stop and say, is it realistic? I mean, I have no crystal ball. If I did, I would not be working right now. I'd be somewhere else, but using that ability somewhere else. But if we don't put something like that and dream and put a target on it, I don't know how we actually make things happen to get there.
Predictions are tough, especially about the future, Yogi Berra. I can't say. I couldn't even fathom a guess. But, I think that in the spirit of exploration, in the spirit of advancement, and moving our society and our world forward, we do need to go to Mars. And, it's the solar system actually has a say in that because Mars and Earth are on their own orbits, and there's a window that's ahead of us in the early to mid-30s, and it's really important to capitalize on that. So, if we actually fritter the next decade and actually don't make, positive movement toward that goal, it's going to get more elusive. Yeah. And I think that's really an important vision that, I would like to see us set as a nation.
I mentioned this vision that Blue has of millions of people living and working in space, right? I have to drop back to why we came up with our motto, Gradatum Ferocer. It's step-by-step ferociously. If you think about millions of people living and working in space or colonizing Mars, I go over in the corner and curl up in the fetal position. It's hard to think about. You got to think about what can I do today? What can I do in 2 years? What can I do in 5 years? We know we can build the infrastructure to lower the costs to get to space, right? We know we can go to the moon. We can begin to build a jump-off point there. We know we can continue to evolve the infrastructure to get more people in space. We can grow the number of people who have been to space. We can take tangible steps to get there, not knowing what it's going to look like in 20 years, but all of us can generally see 1 to 5 to 10 years out, or what's going to happen in our lifetime. So you go tackle those problems.
So going back to something that was talked about earlier in the second panel as well, does NASA should we turn going to the moon over to Blue Origin and SpaceX and let them do it and let NASA concentrate on going to Mars? Because that's exploration. I mean, the moon is too, but, are you of the mindset that we ought to just bypass the moon now and go straight to Mars, or do we need to go?
No, I kind of agree with, a lot of folks are saying that, we have been operating in low Earth orbit for too long, and it's time to get back to cislunar and beyond. And so, I tend to think of the moon as a good step to get to Mars. Do you have to have that step? Probably not. Maybe not. There might be other ways to do it. But no, I think that it still makes sense, and I don't think that NASA should back out of that at all.
Yeah, I actually think because we've been focused on different things in space that to retarget the workforce, because you need that educated workforce to do that. That's a great learning ground and an application ground for them to take what they've learned to be able to use it. Now, should we just be focused there for NASA? No. Pop and hop. That's what I say.
That's Scott?
Yeah, I think you got to get good at something, right? And today, we're not great because we don't do it very often, right? The old 10,000 hour thing applies. We got to get good at it. So the ability, and it's going to start because the people that were good at this and continue to be good at it are NASA. So we got to learn from them. Follow on, but get good at it by making it routine, making it more and more manageable by doing it more and more often.
It's a partnership.
Absolutely.
Because sharing that knowledge across, that's going to be very, very important. The same token, shifting how we've normally done things to do it in a new way. That's where the commercial partner will help us shift on the NASA side, and the NASA side can pass our heritage and lessons learned.
Well, I say that from the standpoint when I talked about NASA because after Falcon, when we talked about Falcon Heavy in the last discussion, after Falcon Heavy flew, there was a degree of hand-wringing at NASA from people that I know about, oh boy, if they can do that, maybe we don't need SL. Maybe SLS is going to end up because of the cost of $2 billion every time you lift off, and you can't afford to fly the darn thing more than once a year, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, that's why I say, should NASA, if you can't fly it more than once or so a year, then maybe you just use it to go to Mars. Yeah, you see what I'm saying? Is there some reality there to that maybe the private sector is better equipped to do things like the lunar exploration?
But the private sector is only as equipped as it is because of all the work that NASA's done for so many years. Without those lessons that were learned, the private sector, and eventually, if NASA was done away with, there'll be so much talent, so much knowledge that will be lost. And, and the new companies, I can't speak for Blue Origin, but I can for SpaceX a little bit, they don't necessarily avail themselves of all that information anyway. They want to do it on their own. I don't know if you guys are that way too, but Elon is an interesting guy. I toured his plant once, and they had 7 launches at that point. And every engineer I talked to told me what an unbelievable success all those launches were. And then I had my hour with Mr. Musk, and I said, wow, you must be really proud. Your engineers are so pleased with what you've done. And he goes, why is that? And I said, well, you've had 7 successful launches. And Musk said, I have not had one single success, not yet. And I go, based on, he said there was not one launch that everything worked properly. And until we can make everything work properly, I don't count it as a success. Now, that's a different kind of attitude. And that's one of the reasons I think SpaceX is doing pretty well pretty quickly.
We talked about about where we'd be a vision of 50 years, and we can only really look 10 years down the road, right? But what about in research, and what are we going to be accomplishing in science and in medicine? And what are the things that you see out there that are probably the biggest things that we need to tackle and we'll be able to solve in space? Is it still the idea that we can cure cancer in zero gravity? I mean, are there things like that that are just, cures for Alzheimer's that might be more, readily solved and, in space than on Earth? Where are we with all that? Is space, in other words, does space still have the same, as we talked about in the earlier panel, is there still this feeling that we're going to have all these wonderful medical and scientific breakthroughs in space? Do we still believe that, is what I'm saying?
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, but I will say we will have breakthroughs. But now, if you're talking about solving cancer in society, we may not do that, but in trying to get human sustainability in space, there will be a lot of things we'll discover about how the human body works that we will be able to apply. It's like anything, even engineering, and I'm an engineer, what we did to press that. There's an old story that I was told, and I was alive when it happened. We have ballpoint pens, because that's the way we solved the problem, but the Soviets, used the pencil for the gravity issue. I think that's an analogy for the human body. There'll be a lot of discoveries that we'll be able to apply back here. And then once we have, it's a regular thing, maybe that'll become, okay, let's start seeing if we can do these bigger medical scientific goals. But I think the push to have humans sustaining in space, that's going to have a lot of breakthroughs.
But sustainability is something that now, as far as, and the sustainability is one of the ways you get to these breakthroughs, because you got to be up there all the time doing it. We're much better positioned, though, now for sustainability in space because of the fact that you have, we talked about it, all these commercial companies now, and everybody. There's going to be a fleet of different kinds of rockets flying off the pads at Kennedy and the Cape in the next few years. I went back, I started trying to look at all the names of all these things, and let's see, you got the New Glenn, and you got somebody's doing the Vulcan, and so I'm like, man, the numbers of rockets that are going to be leaving here, but it's sustainability, because somebody's always going to be up there is what I'm trying to drive at, and that helps, doesn't it? No?
I think it does, but I think it goes back to your question earlier. Is it the technology, or is it the explorer part of it? And Lewis and Clark, the exploration of the poles, those all came up with new resources, new things, but it was the human story that excited people in those generations. I think it's the human story that continues to be why people gravitate towards this. It's that explorer part of it.
I think if we're going to solve cancer, we're going to probably do it here on Earth. We go into space to explore, to learn about our origins as a civilization, about our planet, about our solar system. And we actually operate in space to learn about the universe more broadly. We have made amazing strides over the past 25 to 50 years in our understanding of the universe as a whole, not just our solar system. And that's still really exciting. And that is still really evolving. And there are just amazing things around the corner in our ability to measure and discover and understand things that bring us back to the very moment that the universe was created. So I'm really bullish on that, and I think that it's really important that we don't just at this point turn over exploration to the commercial sector. That may work someday, but right now NASA actually has the existence proof that it can actually further that goal, and has done it in a big way. So
Cynthia?
I'm
still putting my money there.
Yeah, I'm with you. And there's actually, that makes a very special place for NASA. You talked about it in the other panels. Are we just the pass-through? And that's a really important question. As long as the question is business model and profits and making it affordable, is always pushing on that side, then you need a side that will not bring in the technology and exploration part. You need a different model, which is where NASA fits in to do the exploration. So I'm very much in that place too.
Well, I was just going to say, I think we lose sight of one thing sometimes. Money's important, there's no doubt, and making money is, but it's the passion that people have for a particular goal or a particular vision or whatever. That's what makes the difference usually. Most of us that are in this part of the world, we're here because we probably could have done much better somewhere else, hopefully anyway, financially, but we're in it because we have a passion for what we do. And we don't go to work, we just, every day we're doing something we've always wanted to do.
We've only got a couple more minutes left, but I did want to ask you, because you've been on both sides of the coin. You work for the space agency, now you're a university president. Do you see a lot more collaboration, a lot more input from, and working with, NASA, with the space agency at university level? Do you see them more interested now than maybe they were 40 years ago in the students that are coming out of here?
Well, and we may be a special case, but the industry in our area is so interested in hiring the cream. I wish we could produce a little more cream. Most of our students are really good. The graduates are excellent. But, there's a huge interest in getting that fuel to make their engine run. And that fuel is the new talent that's coming out of the universities. And so I see that, whether I talk to L3 Harris or I talk to Blue Origin or whomever, and NASA too. I mean, they are in great desire of this new talent that's being produced in the universities around the country. And to do that, they sponsor research, they get themselves involved with the university. So I see it's much stronger than it was 40 years ago.
Alyssa, do you see a real degree of interest in what you're doing and who you are from, the outside, not just from within the university community?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that we're kind of seeing like the boom of space, and also with the collaboration between the private and the private sector, and also with NASA, and having more collaborations and being able to explore more different parts of space at the same time. So going to the moon and Mars while also continuing to do stuff in low Earth orbit. So we're being able to do more in space, and with that, I think we're going to be having more people being involved in space. And with more private sectors coming up, you have more jobs that offer more potential in space, more people going to space. So I feel like in space in general, as the next generation comes in, there's so many more roles to fall into because there's so many more possibilities happening right now in the space program.
Good. Final thoughts quickly, and we're going to wrap it up. Cynthia, we'll start with you.
And one of the things that hasn't been touched on, and I talked a little bit with Winston, that it's really important, we need to make sure exposure to that next generation is a wider exposure. And so we have to figure out a way to get the excitement out there as a normal part of everyday life as a possibility. One of the things that I find that's missing is if they don't know, by the time we reach them at college level, they're already on paths that we can't redirect. So somehow we've got to start tapping into that. And also, in the area that I work, we have specialized technologies, and so we're looking, half of my organization has PhDs, and some in physics or EE. But what we're finding is we can't get that diversity because by the time they get into graduate school, it's already screened out the diversity of the types of students. So that's another area that I would like to see us focus on, and reaching down even below undergraduate to get that pipeline really moving forward.
Well, I just want to make one comment to correct something you said before, sort of.
I was wrong?
No, well, you were not wrong. You were just off base, I think.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Yeah, that's true. I was either fortunate enough or unfortunate enough once in a set of speakers. I followed Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And don't ever do that if you can help it. And he wanted to address the crowd, and he said, how many of you are upset that Pluto is no longer a planet? And you know what he said? Get over it.
Put the mic down.
You have to remember that I just had dinner with Alan Stern, so I was influenced a bit.
We need more scientists and engineers. There is an imbalance looking into the future, and to me, it's an urgent matter of national well-being, health, and security. And universities and NASA play a big role in that. Yogi Berra also said, "You better go to your friends' funerals if you expect them to come to yours." And so, after I'm long gone, I'm really hoping that some of the future leaders and current leaders in the audience here today will have thought through, what their inspirational moonshot is, will have taken the time to build support and evangelize it, and will have maybe spent a good portion of their careers trying to make it a reality, because that's how we actually move our society and civilization forward.
Having been 25 years government, now about 12 years on the commercial side, working for a couple of the up-and-coming commercial entities, people always ask me the difference. What's the difference? And they say, why can commercial move so fast? And part of it is just the encumbrances that are put on the government. It's public money, it's lots of regulations, it's lots of policy. The private side doesn't necessarily follow that. We've got to figure out a regulatory regime, like the least sexy of topics, right? A regulatory regime that actually enables the commercial entities to continue to grow without being eventually subsumed and encumbered by all of that government bureaucracy. It's the thing that enables the commercial side to move fast. There's a reason for it on the government side, and that's that sort of sweet spot that you're looking for. But it can't be all one way or the other. I think this balance is super important.
Yeah, going a little bit back to kind of like the exposure that we have right now, and kind of going back to like why we're doing all this. And I feel like a lot of that, looking back at all the technological advancements and things that have been discovered and made through space exploration isn't always translated to the general public about how big of an impact that has been made. And I feel like as we continue to share what we do in space and how that comes back to Earth, we'll not only encourage more people to want to get involved, and also, obviously, most of us in here have that general interest in space, but it's also sharing that along with everyone. And that, of course, always trickles down to the younger generations of them getting involved as well and wanting to have their part in the project as a whole.
Ladies and gentlemen, our panel, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, dear. Nice to meet you. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you. Lots of fun. Thanks, bro.